My name is Matilda Hayes, and I was 24 years old the night my parents left me in a trauma ward so they could get deep tissue massages. I had spent 14 hours digging two lost climbers out of a frozen ravine in the Colorado Rockies. Just as we secured the harness, the mountain gave way. The secondary collapse trapped my right side under packed ice. My femur snapped in 3 places. The rescue helicopter dropped me at a Denver hospital where surgeons spent 6 hours putting metal pins in my leg. When I finally woke up, the room was cold and quiet. There were no flowers. There was no panicked mother holding my hand. There was just an empty vinyl chair and the steady beep of a heart monitor. I reached for my phone, expecting a dozen missed calls. Instead, there was a single text from my father, Richard. Your sister Sydney has a spa weekend in Aspen, and the deposit is non-refundable. You are an adult. Figure it out. I stared at the screen while the frostbite on my fingers throbbed. I thought being crushed under a ton of snow was the coldest thing I would ever experience. I was wrong. By the time I left that hospital bed, my family would learn exactly what a rescue specialist does when she stops trying to save them. Welcome back to Luke Vengeance, where quiet women stop begging for a seat at the table and let the truth do the talking. If you have ever been the dependable one in a family that only takes, tell us your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. I am a wilderness search and rescue specialist. My job is dirt and ice. I track people who underestimate the wild and drag them back to safety. It is gritty and it is exhausting. My parents treat my career like a public embarrassment. They prefer the polished world of luxury ski resorts, where survival means securing a reservation at a Michelin star restaurant. For years, I tried to bridge the gap between us. I paid my own way through advanced medical certifications. I worked double shifts in sub-zero temperatures. I thought if I saved enough lives, they might eventually look at me with the same pride they reserve for my younger sister, Sydney. Sydney has never worked a shift in her life. Her greatest accomplishment is curating an aesthetic social media feed paid for by our parents. I laid in that sterile bed, staring at the ceiling tiles. The medication dulled the pain in my leg, but the text message stung sharp and clear. Figure it out. It was a convenient philosophy for people who wanted the image of a strong, independent daughter without the burden of supporting one. A young nurse came in to check my vitals. She scanned the empty room and gave me a soft, pitying smile. I hated that smile. I refused to be a tragedy. I pulled up my banking application to check my emergency fund for the incoming medical bills. That is when I saw the first anomaly. The joint account my father helped me set up when I was a teenager was thousands of dollars lighter than it should be. I did not cry. I did not throw my phone across the room. I just took a slow breath and started scrolling through the transaction history. The pain medication wore off around midnight. My leg felt like it was encased in wet cement, drying too tight over shattered bone. The hospital room was silent except for the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen valve and the distant hum of the elevator bay. I needed a distraction to stop my mind from replaying the terrifying sound of the avalanche. I reached for my phone on the plastic tray table and opened a social media application. The first image on my feed was blindingly bright. It was a photograph of my younger sister, Sydney. She was sitting in a plush leather booth at a 5-star lodge in Aspen. To her left was my mother, Patricia, draped in a heavy cashmere wrap. To her right was my father, Richard, holding up a crystal flute of vintage champagne. The lighting in the photograph was immaculate. It highlighted Sydney's perfect salon blowout and the pristine, undisturbed snow falling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them. Beneath the photograph was a caption that made a wave of nausea rise in my throat. Recovering from the stress of our hero's accident. #family strength. #Aspen healing. I stared at the bright screen while the frostbite on my fingertips pulsed with a dull ache. The post already had over 1,000 likes. Dozens of comments from their wealthy country club friends offered thoughts and prayers for my recovery. They praised my parents for remaining so remarkably strong during a crisis. They told Sydney to take time for her own mental health during this difficult period. The hypocrisy was physically revolting. Not a single one of those people knew I was lying alone in a dark trauma ward, eating ice chips. Sydney has always possessed a terrifying talent for weaponizing my labor to enhance her own image. She is the golden child, a woman who has never worked a grueling shift in her life. Her greatest accomplishment is curating an aesthetic lifestyle funded entirely by Richard and Patricia. When I graduated from the rigorous Search and Rescue Academy 2 years ago, she posted a photo of herself holding my certificate, making the moment about her proud sister era. Now she was using my shattered femur to farm sympathy online while drinking imported alcohol on a luxury vacation. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the thin mattress. I did not shed a tear. Crying is a luxury for people who believe someone will eventually arrive to comfort them. I had learned a long time ago that my family viewed my resilience not as a virtue, but as an excuse to neglect me. If Matilda is tough, they reasoned, then Matilda does not need our attention. It was a convenient rationale that allowed them to redirect all their resources and affection towards Sydney. They viewed my gritty blue-collar career as a public embarrassment, contrasting sharply with their prestige-obsessed social circles. The heavy wooden door to my room clicked open, interrupting my thoughts. I expected the night shift nurse to administer another dose of morphine. Instead, a tall African-American woman walked in. She was not wearing standard hospital scrubs. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer over a sensible silk blouse, and a high-level security badge hung from a woven lanyard around her neck. Her name was Clara. I recognized her from the emergency intake desk hours earlier, when the paramedics wheeled me through the sliding glass doors. Clara was a veteran billing supervisor. She had worked at the Denver Trauma Center for 2 decades, starting her career as an emergency triage nurse before moving upstairs to handle the complex financial architecture of trauma medicine. Clara possessed the kind of quiet, imposing authority that demanded immediate respect from doctors and administrators alike. She closed the door softly behind her, ensuring the latch clicked shut. She pulled up the vinyl visitor chair and sat down. She did not ask how my pain levels were. She did not offer hollow platitudes about my bravery on the mountain. She leaned forward and placed a thick manila folder on the edge of my bed. Her dark eyes were warm, but her expression was deadly serious. "Matilda," she began, her voice a low, steady hum in the quiet room. "I have processed thousands of catastrophic injury claims in this hospital. I see families at their best, and I see them at their worst. I try not to get involved in the personal dynamics of my patients. But I looked at your intake forms tonight, and there is something about your family you deserve to know." I pushed myself up against the stiff pillows, ignoring the sharp ache radiating from my hip. Clara opened the folder. She pointed to a line item highlighted in bright yellow ink. When a registered search and rescue specialist is critically injured in the line of duty, the state union automatically triggers a catastrophic injury payout. It is a vital financial safety net designed to cover emergency surgeries, out-of-network trauma care, and specialized physical therapy. It ensures the rescuer does not go bankrupt while fighting to walk again. The funds are supposed to be wired directly to the hospital billing department to clear the immediate debts. Clara traced a manicured finger across the page. "The union authorized your payout 3 hours after the helicopter brought you in," she explained. "But the money never reached our billing department. The automated system flagged the transfer due to a routing anomaly." That is when I dug into the digital footprint and found the diversion. I felt a cold chill spread down my spine that had nothing to do with the Denver winter. "A diversion?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clara nodded gravely. "Someone contacted the union representative claiming to be your emergency medical proxy. They presented a joint banking authorization form. It was an old document from when you were a teenager, but the signatures were still legally binding. They instructed the union to bypass the hospital escrow and deposit the entire hazard payout directly into that shared checking account. They claimed they were handling your private medical trust." I thought about the text message from my father. I thought about the champagne flutes in the pristine Aspen Lodge. The math aligned with a sickening perfection. The joint account was one my father had insisted on keeping open for supposed emergency tax purposes, masking his control as paternal care. Richard had not just abandoned me to a surgeon, he had used the chaos of my near-death experience to intercept my union benefits. He redirected the exact funds meant to rebuild my shattered leg and poured them into a vacation account. The exorbitant out-of-network expenses they were racking up at the five-star spa were being financed by my blood and broken bones. Clara closed the folder and rested her hand briefly on mine. "I cannot legally freeze that transfer," she said softly. "From an administrative standpoint, the union complied with a valid routing request. But as a woman who has seen financial abuse destroy good people, I am telling you to secure your assets immediately. Your father is listed as your primary emergency contact. If you go under anesthesia for your next bone graft tomorrow, he has the authority to make broad financial and medical decisions on your behalf." The air in the room felt suddenly thin. My family was not just careless or selfish. They were predatory. The narrative I had told myself my entire life, that they simply did not understand my rugged lifestyle, evaporated in an instant. They understood it perfectly well. They understood that my danger could be monetized. The emotional neglect was merely a smokescreen for active financial theft. I thanked Clara. She gave me a curt nod of solidarity and slipped out of the room, returning to the quiet hum of the midnight corridor. I was left alone in the dark again. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer a wounded daughter hoping for a phone call. I was a professional tracker staring at a fresh trail of evidence. The physical pain in my leg faded to a dull background noise, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. If Richard wanted to play a game of ledgers and routing numbers, he was about to learn a very painful lesson. A rescue specialist knows how to navigate treacherous terrain, and I was preparing to map out every single dollar he had stolen. I needed a secure internet connection. I needed a laptop. And most importantly, I needed to ensure my father did not realize I was hunting him. The digital clock on the wall shifted to 2 a.m. The sterile quiet of the hospital room felt suffocating. A story confined to a medical bed loses momentum, and I knew I could not fight a financial war using only a compromised smartphone. I needed a secure terminal. I needed a weapon. Before Clara, the billing supervisor, left my room, I had asked her to make a single encrypted phone call to my unit headquarters. I memorized the unit dispatch number years ago for emergencies exactly like this one. 30 minutes later, a soft, rhythmic knock broke the silence. The heavy wooden door clicked open, and Elias Vaughn slipped inside. Commander Vaughn is my search and rescue mentor. He is a man carved from the harsh Colorado landscape. He has spent 30 years pulling stranded hikers off frozen peaks and surviving avalanches that swallowed lesser climbers. He wears a faded canvas jacket and walks with a slight limp from a shattered knee he suffered on a rescue mission a decade ago. Vaughn represents the true resilient spirit of the mountain community. He is everything my superficial, status-obsessed parents are not. Vaughn closed the door silently and locked the deadbolt. He did not offer hollow sympathies or ask how my fractured femur was healing. Mountain people do not waste breath on the obvious. He walked directly to the bedside table and pulled a rugged black laptop from his tactical canvas pack. He set the heavy machine on my rolling tray. "You requested an untraceable connection," he whispered. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "I brought the encrypted field terminal. It runs on a decentralized network. Nobody can track your search history or monitor your keystrokes." I thanked him and flipped the screen open. The keyboard glowed with a faint red backlight. My fingers were still wrapped in thick bandages to protect the damaged tissue from the frostbite, but I ignored the stinging pain. I typed my security credentials into the terminal. Vaughn stood near the window, peering through the plastic blinds to keep watch over the empty corridor. He understood the gravity of the situation without needing a lengthy explanation. When a rescue specialist asks for an encrypted field terminal in the middle of the night, it means a predator is circling. I navigated to the banking portal. My inner monologue, which had been a chaotic storm of betrayal and disbelief, sharpened into a cold, tactical focus. I was no longer a wounded daughter. I was an investigator hunting a thief. I pulled up the joint checking account my father Richard had convinced me to open when I turned 18. He had framed it as a prudent administrative safety measure. He claimed he needed access to manage my affairs whenever I was deployed on extended backcountry missions without cellular reception. I had foolishly trusted him. I had handed him the keys to my financial survival. The main dashboard loaded onto the screen. The current balance stared back at me in bold, black numerals. It was devastatingly low. I opened the detailed transaction ledger and began a forensic audit of my own life. I traced the exact flow of the union payout. The catastrophic injury fund had deposited a substantial sum into the account yesterday afternoon, right around the time I was being wheeled into my second reconstructive surgery. I scrolled down to see where the funds had gone. The money had not stayed in the account for more than 10 minutes. It began to hemorrhage instantly, fracturing into dozens of rapid outgoing transactions. I watched the digital trail lead directly away from my medical needs and straight up the mountain to Aspen. The charges were specific and sickening. There was a transaction for $3,000 at a premier luxury spa. The vendor description listed a package of volcanic ash mud treatments and deep tissue basalt stone therapies. My mother, Patricia, was enjoying a hot stone massage, while a surgeon was drilling metal pins into my shattered leg. I clicked the next row. $2,000 at an exclusive alpine outfitter. Sydney had purchased designer snow apparel. I knew she did not ski. She despised the cold. She only wanted the pristine, tailored gear to pose for photographs on the lodge balcony. She was using the hazard pay I earned by freezing in a ravine to buy fashionable winter clothing for her curated social media aesthetic. The list continued to unfold. $500 for a private sommelier consultation. $800 for a dinner at a restaurant known for serving imported caviar. Each transaction was a deliberate, calculated insult. They were not just spending my money, they were actively converting my physical suffering into their opulent leisure. They were harvesting my trauma to fund a lifestyle they could not afford on their own. Vaughn turned from the window and glanced at the glowing screen. His jaw tightened as he read the vendor names. He had seen me haul a stranded climber 2 miles through a blizzard on a makeshift sled. He knew exactly what it cost me to earn that hazard pay. He placed a heavy, weathered hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity. "We do not let our own bleed out on the mountain," he whispered. "Tell me what you need to do." "I need to build an airtight record," I replied, keeping my voice low. "I cannot simply accuse them. They will deny it. They will spin a story about administrative errors or mismanaged funds. I need irrefutable proof." I opened a blank spreadsheet document alongside the banking ledger. I began the grueling, meticulous process of cataloging their theft. I labeled the first column with the date. The second column held the timestamp. The third recorded the vendor name, and the fourth documented the stolen amount. I typed line after line, ignoring the sharp throbbing in my frostbitten hands. Every keystroke was a small, precise strike against their illusion. I mapped out the architecture of their betrayal. The spreadsheet grew into a devastating timeline. I could see the exact moment my father authorized the union diversion. I could track the minute my mother swiped the debit card for her spa treatment. I was constructing a digital armory, gathering the ammunition I would need to dismantle their carefully crafted public image. The quiet intensity of the hunt fueled me. For years, I had allowed my parents to dictate the narrative. They controlled the story, painting me as the rugged, unrefined outcast, while presenting themselves as sophisticated pillars of society. They viewed my career as a tedious burden, unless it could be exploited for sympathy or financial gain. This ledger proved they were nothing more than parasitic opportunists. I reached the bottom of the transaction history. The remaining balance was a fraction of what it should be, but there was still enough left to secure. I opened a separate browser tab and navigated to a secure offshore credit union recommended by my rescue team for international deployments. I rapidly opened a new private individual account. I initiated an immediate transfer, draining the final remaining dollars from the compromised joint account. I left the balance at exactly 0. I saved the extensive spreadsheet onto a partitioned, encrypted drive on Vaughn's laptop. The foundation for my retaliation was set. The evidence was secured in a format that could not be deleted or manipulated by my father. I closed the banking portals, feeling a brief surge of dark satisfaction. But a seasoned tracker knows that a cornered predator is dangerous. Just as the transfer confirmation appeared on the screen, a harsh, automated chime echoed from my personal mobile phone resting on the tray table. The sudden noise shattered the quiet focus of the room. Vaughn immediately stepped closer to the bed, his eyes scanning the glowing screen of the device. I picked up the phone. It was an urgent alert from my primary health insurance provider. The hospital administration portal had generated an automated warning. The premium payment for my emergency medical coverage had failed. The account was flagged for immediate suspension. I tapped the notification to read the full message. The primary payment method linked to my insurance policy had been manually altered just moments ago. My father had realized I might eventually check the hospital billing department. He knew he had to cut off my access to medical care before I could question the missing union funds. He had intentionally frozen my health insurance while I was lying in a trauma ward. A new text message appeared beneath the insurance alert. It was from Richard. The tone was sickeningly sweet, masking a clear threat. "Having some banking issues, sweetie," the message read. "Transfer $10,000 back to the Aspen account, and I will get your hospital insurance sorted right away." He was holding my medical coverage hostage. He was attempting to extort the emergency funds I had just secured. The digital hunt was over. The active financial warfare had just begun. The American healthcare system is a ruthless machine. A suspended insurance policy during an inpatient trauma stay is not merely an administrative error. It is a financial death sentence. I lay in the sterile Denver hospital bed, calculating the sheer cost of my shattered femur. Emergency airlift extraction, 6 hours of orthopedic surgery, titanium rods, bone grafts, weeks of specialized inpatient physical therapy. The final invoice would easily crest $500,000. My father, Richard, understood this staggering reality perfectly. He was leveraging my crushed leg to extort the exact capital he needed to maintain his luxurious facade in Aspen. Richard operates on a simple predatory logic. He views relationships strictly through the lens of leverage and liability. For decades, he has built his identity around the illusion of elite wealth. He drives leased European sedans and purchases expensive rounds of premium golf at his exclusive country club. But his actual liquidity is a carefully guarded mirage. He treats his daughters as divergent assets. Sydney is his social asset, a beautiful, curated extension of his desired status. I was always supposed to be the invisible, low-maintenance asset. My grueling career in wilderness search and rescue demanded nothing from him financially. But the moment the mountain collapsed and I suddenly required extensive resources, I transformed into a liability. Now he was actively trying to liquidate me. I stared at the glowing screen of the encrypted field terminal. The text message demanding $10,000 burned a hole in my composure. Commander Vaughn leaned over my shoulder, reading the extortion demand. The hardened lines around his eyes deepened into a fierce scowl. Mountain rescuers operate on a strict code of mutual survival. You never leave a wounded teammate behind, and you certainly never steal their provisions. Vaughn offered a low, gravelly suggestion. He proposed driving up to the 5-star resort in Aspen to have a direct, physical conversation with my father. I appreciated the loyalty, but I shook my head. Intimidation is the language my parents expect from my rugged blue-collar world. They view physical confrontation as evidence of our lack of sophistication. If Vaughn showed up at the pristine ski lodge, Richard would simply call the local authorities, play the victim, and use the incident to further assassinate my character. We could not fight them on the mountain. We had to fight them on paper. A cornered narcissist is incredibly dangerous. If I refused the extortion demand directly, Richard would instantly cancel my medical policy, leaving me stranded with insurmountable debt. If I confronted him with the detailed spreadsheet of his stolen union funds, he would panic. He would immediately transfer the remaining stolen cash into untraceable offshore accounts and hire elite attorneys to challenge my access. I needed to keep him arrogant. I needed him to believe he still held the leash. I navigated away from the spreadsheet and opened my secure private banking portal. I did not wire $10,000. Instead, I initiated a transfer for exactly $50. The pitiful amount was a calculated tactical choice. Sending nothing would trigger his rage. Sending the full amount would drain my survival reserves. Sending $50 signaled profound desperation. It painted a picture of a terrified, injured girl scrambling to appease her powerful father with whatever meager scraps she could find. It was the perfect diversionary bait. Next, I opened the messaging application to compose my reply. Every single word needed to drip with submission and panic. I spent 4 minutes drafting the response, ensuring the tone sounded suitably confused and helpless. "Dad, please," I typed. "I am so scared. The pain medication is making my head fuzzy, and the bank locked my checking account for fraud alerts when I tried to move the large sum. I could only push $50 through on the mobile application before the screen froze. I will call the branch manager first thing in the morning to unlock the rest of the funds. Please do not let them stop my bone graft surgery." I read the message twice. It was pathetic. It was exactly what he wanted to hear. I pressed send. The tension in the hospital room grew thick. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. Vaughn watched the silent phone resting on the plastic tray table. Minutes stretched into an uncomfortable eternity. We waited for the predator to evaluate the bait. 3 minutes later, the screen illuminated the dark room. Richard replied. "Calm down, Matilda," his message read. "You always overreact under pressure. I will call the insurance broker and buy you a 24-hour grace period. Sort out your banking restrictions tomorrow, or I cannot help you. Focus on healing." I let out a long, slow exhale. The sheer arrogance of his response was sickening, but the strategy had worked flawlessly. He took the red herring without a second thought. He felt magnanimous. He genuinely believed I was lying in a hospital bed, weeping over a frozen debit card, entirely reliant on his paternal mercy. By granting me a fake 24-hour grace period, he thought he was demonstrating his supreme control. In reality, he had just handed me the exact window of time I needed to dismantle his entire financial architecture. The immediate threat of extortion was temporarily neutralized. However, the underlying vulnerability remained glaringly obvious. My medical coverage was still technically under his administrative jurisdiction. I could not rely on his fabricated grace period. The moment he realized the $10,000 was never coming, he would terminate the policy. I needed to sever his access permanently and secure my health care through an impenetrable channel. I looked up at Vaughn. "I need the direct contact number for our state union representative," I told him. "I am going to reroute my primary insurance through my state employment benefits. Once the union takes over the premiums, Richard will be permanently locked out of my medical administration." Vaughn nodded approvingly and reached into his canvas jacket to retrieve his dispatch radio. He began dialing the encrypted union channel. I turned my attention back to the rugged laptop. I opened a new browser tab, preparing to log into the state employee benefit portal. But before I could enter my credentials, an unexpected notification chimed from my secure inbox. It was an automated alert from a public records database I had configured years ago to monitor my credit profile against identity theft. The subject line indicated a new corporate entity had just been registered with the State Department of Revenue. I opened the email expecting a routine administrative error. Instead, I stared at an official digital filing that made my blood run cold. A brand new limited liability company had been established just 48 hours ago. The registered business address belonged to my modest mountain cabin. The primary stakeholder listed on the incorporating documents was my mother, Patricia, and the stated purpose of the business was listed as Extreme Survival Event Planning. My parents were not just stealing my hazard pay, they were building a corporate structure to harvest my identity. The digital alert regarding my mother's new corporate entity blinked on the rugged laptop screen, but I forced myself to compartmentalize the threat. Survival requires prioritizing the most immediate hemorrhage. My medical coverage was currently dangling by a frayed thread, held by a man who viewed my shattered leg as a negotiation tactic. Before I could investigate the limited liability company, I had to permanently sever his jurisdiction over my physical recovery. I looked at Commander Vaughn standing guard near the hospital room door. He held his encrypted dispatch radio out to me. The screen displayed a secure direct line to the State Union Benefits Coordinator. I took the device. My frostbitten fingers were stiff and wrapped in thick gauze, making it difficult to grip the heavy plastic casing, but the adrenaline pulsing through my veins masked the discomfort. A voice answered on the second ring. It was Marcus, the regional director for the Wilderness Search and Rescue Brotherhood. Marcus is a former smoke jumper who lost his left arm in a devastating forest inferno a decade ago. He understands the profound vulnerability of a mutilated body lying in a sterile ward. When I identified myself and explained the situation, his tone shifted from professional courtesy to cold, rigid authority. "You do not need to explain the family dynamics, Matilda," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble over the encrypted frequency. "We process the trauma. We secure the perimeter. Tell me exactly what administrative locks are currently restricting your policy." I relayed the policy numbers and detailed the primary payment method my father had frozen. I explained the 24-hour fabricated grace period Richard had offered as extortion bait. Marcus typed rapidly on his end of the connection. The sound of his keystrokes echoed through the small speaker like a steady drumbeat of incoming cavalry. Within 4 minutes, Marcus bypassed the civilian broker portal entirely. He accessed the state employee overarching healthcare registry. As a registered rescue specialist injured in the line of duty, I qualified for immediate autonomous coverage under the union umbrella. The bureaucratic process was swift and efficient. There were no emotional pleas required. There were no manipulative negotiations. There was only the cold, hard machinery of state legislation working exactly as it was designed to protect a wounded worker. Marcus sent a digital authorization form directly to the encrypted field terminal sitting on my tray table. I reviewed the document. It officially revoked all previous medical proxies and designated the State Union Trust as the sole guarantor for my surgical procedures and physical rehabilitation. I traced my signature onto the digital pad using my uninjured thumb. The moment I submitted the form, a green confirmation banner illuminated the screen. The loop was closed. The vulnerability was patched. The Denver Trauma Center billing department would now route every single invoice through the union escrow, bypassing my father's frozen civilian accounts completely. Richard had just lost his primary weapon, and he was entirely ignorant of his disarmament. I handed the dispatch radio back to Vaughn. A profound sense of relief washed over me, easing the rigid tension in my shoulders. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to believe that obedience to my parents was the only path to security. They demanded compliance in exchange for basic necessities. Taking autonomous control of my health care felt like stepping out of a suffocating shadow and breathing clean, alpine air for the first time. I did not send a triumphant message to my father. I did not taunt him with my newly acquired independence. Silence is a much more lethal tactic. Let him continue to believe he controlled the chessboard. Let him sit in his luxurious Aspen lodge, feeling smug and powerful, while the foundation of his leverage crumbled into dust beneath his feet. The longer he remained oblivious, the more time I had to map out the rest of his predatory architecture. With the medical crisis neutralized, I turned my focus back to the glowing screen of the laptop. The public records database alert regarding the new corporate entity demanded my full attention. I clicked the link to view the official state filings. The document loaded, displaying the crisp digital seal of the Colorado Department of Revenue. The business was registered as a limited liability company. The listed name was Summit Elite Survival Preparedness. The primary operating address was the exact geographic coordinate of my secluded mountain cabin. The registered owner and chief executive officer was Patricia Hayes. My mother had never pitched a tent or started a fire without using chemical accelerants in her entire life. Her idea of braving the elements was enduring a minor draft in the country club dining hall. Seeing her name legally tied to an outdoor survival enterprise was absurd, but the financial implications were terrifying. I navigated to the state domain registry to see if the company had established a digital presence. They had. I typed the corresponding web address into the browser and hit enter. A beautifully designed commercial website populated the screen. The aesthetic was a perfect blend of rugged authenticity and high-end luxury. The background featured sweeping drone footage of the snowy peaks where my rescue team operated. But the true horror was prominently displayed in the center of the homepage. There was a high-resolution photograph of my younger sister, Sydney. She was standing on a picturesque snowy ridge wearing the pristine designer winter apparel she had purchased using my stolen hazard pay. She was not merely posing. She was wearing a replica of my official rescue harness. A coil of professional-grade climbing rope hung over her shoulder. The caption below her photograph read, "Meet Sydney Hayes, elite backcountry survivor and founder of Summit Elite." The nausea I felt earlier returned with a vicious intensity. I clicked through the navigation tabs. The website was a fully functional electronic commerce storefront. They were selling branded survival merchandise, tactical backpacks, thermal blankets, engraved compasses. The prices were exorbitant, targeting the wealthy, inexperienced tourists who flocked to the ski resorts hoping to buy a rugged persona. The merchandise was only a fraction of the deceit. I opened the biography section of the website. It contained a lengthy, detailed narrative outlining Sydney's supposed heroic exploits in the wilderness. I read the paragraphs, and my blood ran cold. The stories were mine. They had taken the grueling, terrifying details of my actual rescue deployments and attributed them to her. The biography described a harrowing night navigating a blizzard to save a lost child. That was my operation from 3 years ago. It detailed a treacherous descent into a cavern to extract a climber with a broken collarbone. That was my mission from last winter. They had meticulously scrubbed my name from my own professional history and pasted her flawless, smiling face over my sacrifices. They were not just stealing my money. They were actively harvesting my identity. They were converting my life-threatening labor into a profitable influencer brand for the Golden Child. The psychological violation was profound. They viewed my existence merely as raw material to be mined and refined for their own status. I sat perfectly still, staring at the glossy, counterfeit reality on the screen. My hands stopped shaking. The betrayal had crossed an invisible boundary, pushing past petty financial theft into deliberate, malicious fraud. I downloaded every single web page. I captured screenshots of the stolen narratives. I archived the images of Sydney wearing the equipment funded by my blood. I filed all of it into the encrypted partition alongside the banking ledgers. As I saved the final digital receipt, another tab on the website caught my eye. It was a link positioned at the very top of the storefront, glowing with a bright, urgent banner. The text read, "Support Our Heroes Recovery Fund." I hovered the cursor over the link. The rolling conflict was relentless. Just as I mapped out the boundaries of the identity theft, the architecture of a much larger federal crime began to reveal itself. I clicked the glowing button, and the browser redirected me to a crowdfunding platform that would change the trajectory of this entire war. The glowing screen of the encrypted field terminal felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I had spent the last 20 minutes navigating the pristine, counterfeit reality of the Summit Elite Survival Preparedness website. Seeing my younger sister Sydney posing in immaculate winter apparel, posing as a seasoned backcountry expert, was nauseating. But the true danger was far more severe than stolen valor. The Wilderness Search and Rescue Brotherhood operates on an uncompromising code of ethics. We do not monetize our rescues. We do not sell cheap tactical merchandise to wealthy tourists. If the state union or my unit commanders discovered this website and mistakenly believed I was the silent partner financing this fraudulent enterprise, I would be stripped of my certification. My career would be over. I glanced at Commander Vaughn. He was still standing watch near the heavy wooden door of my hospital room. I did not show him the screen yet. I needed to map the entire blast radius before I presented the evidence. I turned my focus back to the financial architecture of the limited liability company. The state business registry provided the public incorporating documents, but I needed the hidden internal ledgers. I needed to prove exactly how my mother Patricia had funded this venture. I opened the spreadsheet I had built earlier, charting the unauthorized withdrawals from my compromised joint checking account. I placed it side by side with the Summit Elite corporate filings. I began cross-referencing the dates and the dollar amounts. The puzzle pieces locked together with a chilling precision. The initial seed capital for the shell company had been deposited 3 months ago. I cross-checked my own bank statements from that exact week. It was the same week I had received a substantial union bonus for leading a treacherous high-altitude recovery operation during a whiteout blizzard. I had instructed my father, Richard, to place that bonus into a secure, high-yield savings vehicle for my future mortgage. Instead, he had quietly funneled the entire sum into Patricia's new corporate entity. My grueling labor, the sleepless nights, the frost-bitten toes, and the sheer terror of navigating avalanche terrain had paid the incorporation fees and secured the commercial web domain for a fake influencer brand. The financial audit revealed even deeper layers of deceit. I traced a recurring monthly expenditure routed from the stolen funds to an obscure overseas technology vendor. I ran a quick background query on the vendor name using the secure terminal. The results confirmed my darkest suspicion. The company was a notorious click farm. They specialized in generating artificial social media engagement. I opened Sydney's public profiles on a separate encrypted tab. Her follower count had exploded over the past 90 days. She was projecting the image of a rapidly rising outdoor lifestyle icon. Hundreds of thousands of generic automated accounts were liking her curated photographs and leaving identical supportive comments. My parents were literally purchasing fake popularity for their golden child, using the money I earned pulling stranded hikers out of freezing ravines. They were harvesting my authentic trauma and repackaging it into artificial social clout. I scrolled through the merchandise catalog on the Summit Elite storefront. They were peddling items branded with Sydney's counterfeit survival logo. I pulled the supply chain data hidden in the website's source code. The tactical backpacks and thermal blankets were not professional-grade equipment. They were cheap, low-quality imports manufactured in bulk for pennies on the dollar. They were slapping a premium price tag on useless gear and marketing it to the opulent ski resort crowd in Aspen. The profound cultural contrast made my stomach turn. Real survival in the Rocky Mountains requires grit, reliable equipment, and a selfless dedication to the team. A failing thermal blanket can cost a stranded climber their life. Sydney and Patricia were selling a dangerous illusion to wealthy tourists who equated a high price tag with actual safety. They were mocking the very principles my rescue unit held sacred. The betrayal was comprehensive. Richard handled the financial extraction. Patricia provided the corporate shell. Sydney served as the pristine, smiling face of the operation. They functioned as a coordinated parasitic unit. They viewed my physical existence solely as a raw resource to be mined. If I was injured, they extracted sympathy and hazard pay. If I survived, they extracted my operational stories and professional credibility to sell cheap backpacks. I placed my uninjured hand flat against the plastic hospital tray table to steady myself. Emotion is a liability during an investigation. I forced the rising anger down into a tight, cold knot in my stomach. I began the meticulous process of securing the digital footprint. I used the encrypted terminal to capture high-resolution screenshots of every single web page. I archived the biography section where Sydney had plagiarized my most harrowing rescue missions. I downloaded the supply chain invoices proving the merchandise was manufactured using my stolen union bonus. I saved the receipts from the overseas click farm documenting the purchased followers. I organized the files into a secure, locked directory. I was no longer merely building a defense against an extortion attempt. I was constructing a comprehensive legal portfolio. This was corporate malfeasance. This was a systematic effort to defraud the public using stolen credentials. I named the digital folder with a simple numeric code, ensuring the contents remained hidden, even if the laptop was somehow compromised. The digital hunt was physically exhausting. The pain in my shattered femur flared, demanding another dose of heavy medication. I knew the night shift nurse would return soon to check my vitals. I needed to finish the audit and shut down the terminal before anyone else entered the room. I reviewed the compiled spreadsheet one final time. Every stolen dollar was accounted for. Every fake follower was documented. The architecture of their sociopathy was mapped and securely archived. I had enough evidence to dismantle the Summit elite facade and expose my parents to the scrutiny they so desperately avoided. I was preparing to log out of the state business registry when my eyes caught the glowing banner hovering at the top of the Summit Elite storefront. Support Our Heroes Recovery Fund. The link had appeared briefly during my initial scan of the website, but the sheer magnitude of the corporate fraud had distracted me. Now, with the primary architecture documented, I directed my attention back to that specific, glowing button. The wording was peculiar. It did not explicitly mention my name. It simply referenced a hero. It was designed to evoke maximum sympathy while maintaining a calculated layer of plausible deniability. I hovered the cursor over the hyperlink. My rescue unit had a strict protocol regarding charitable fundraising. We never solicited public donations for individual injuries. The Union Trust was designed to prevent our members from relying on the unpredictable charity of strangers. A public fundraising campaign violated the core ethos of our brotherhood. If my parents were publicly soliciting money using my accident as the catalyst, the situation was about to escalate from a private family dispute into a very public scandal. The local climbing community is a tight-knit, fiercely loyal network. They look out for their own. If they believed one of their rescue specialists was facing financial ruin, they would empty their own pockets to help. I clicked the glowing banner. The browser redirected me away from the counterfeit merchandise storefront and loaded a prominent international crowdfunding platform. A new page rendered on the screen. The title of the campaign read, "Support Our Brave Search and Rescue Hero Through Devastating Recovery." The featured image was a photograph of me. It was not a recent picture from the trauma ward. It was a candid shot taken 2 years ago, showing me exhausted and covered in mud after a grueling 3-day search operation. My parents had scoured my private social media history to find the most desperate-looking image available. The campaign description was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. It detailed the avalanche. It described my shattered leg and the extensive frostbite. It claimed that the medical bills were insurmountable and that my family was struggling to cover the costs of my specialized rehabilitation. It begged the community to open their hearts and their wallets to save a young woman who had sacrificed everything for the mountain. I looked at the total amount raised. The progress bar was nearly full. The campaign had been active for less than 48 hours, and the numbers glowing on the screen were staggering. I felt the air leave my lungs. The rolling conflict had just uncovered the most sickening layer of their deceit. The glowing digits on the crowdfunding campaign page burned into my vision. $45,000. The green progress bar was nearly overflowing its designated boundary, indicating the initial financial goal had been shattered within a matter of days. Beneath the stolen photograph of my exhausted, mud-covered face, a scrolling list of recent donors updated in real time. I leaned closer to the encrypted field terminal, ignoring the sharp ache radiating from my shattered femur. I recognized the names populating that list. These were not anonymous philanthropists or wealthy associates from my father's country club. These were my peers. I saw a donation for $200 from a veteran avalanche forecaster named David. David lived out of a retrofitted cargo van year-round, just so he could afford the expensive permits required to survey the most dangerous peaks in the state. I saw a contribution from Sarah, a junior wilderness paramedic who worked 3 separate minimum wage jobs to pay for her advanced medical trauma certifications. She had given $50. In the Rocky Mountain outdoor ecosystem, $50 is a profound sacrifice. It represents a week of groceries or crucial repairs to climbing gear. The people donating to this campaign operated on a strict, sacred code of mutual survival. In the high-altitude wilderness, your life depends entirely on the person holding the other end of your climbing rope. We do not care about prestige zip codes or designer labels. We care about resilience, loyalty, and keeping each other alive when the environment turns lethal. When someone in our brotherhood falls, the rest of the community rallies without hesitation. They empty their modest bank accounts because they know the injured rescuer would do the exact same thing for them. My parents understood none of this. Richard and Patricia viewed the rugged mountain culture with barely concealed disgust. They preferred the manicured lawns of elite golf courses and the velvet ropes of exclusive galas. Yet they were perfectly willing to exploit the fierce loyalty of my chosen family. They had weaponized the climbing community's sacred code, translating authentic compassion into a digital revenue stream for their own frivolous consumption. While Sarah, the junior paramedic, surrendered her meager grocery budget to help me walk again, my sister Sydney was browsing high-end boutiques in Aspen. The profound injustice of the situation made the sterile hospital room feel suddenly claustrophobic. The betrayal had mutated. It was no longer merely a private familial dispute over intercepted union benefits. It was a parasitic attack on an entire community. I needed irrefutable proof detailing exactly where that $45,000 was residing. Crowdfunding platforms typically obscure the final banking destinations from the public-facing interface to protect user privacy. However, they are required by federal regulations to register the official beneficiary entity within the page source architecture. I glanced toward the hospital room door. Commander Vaughn stood silent and vigilant, his broad shoulders blocking the hallway light. He was a living embodiment of the very community my parents were currently defrauding. I could not tell him about the campaign yet. If a veteran search and rescue commander learned that a country club socialite was stealing emergency funds from his junior medics, the situation would escalate into a physical confrontation. I had to secure the digital paper trail first. I opened a diagnostic script on the rugged laptop. My frostbitten fingers typed the commands, slowly navigating through the complex layers of the website's source code. I bypassed the encrypted payment gateways and located the primary disbursement registry. The platform required a verified commercial or personal routing number to release the accumulated capital. The diagnostic tool extracted the hidden digits and displayed them on the glowing screen. I opened my archive and cross-referenced the numbers against the corporate filings I had downloaded earlier. The match was exact and undeniable. The donations were not being held in a medical escrow account. They were not routing to the Denver Trauma Center billing department. Every single dollar surrendered by the generous Colorado outdoor community was flowing directly into the corporate checking account of Summit Elite Survival Preparedness. Patricia and Richard were systematically laundering charitable contributions through their fraudulent influencer shell company. They were soliciting funds across state lines using a deceptive narrative and a stolen identity. This was not simply bad parenting or selfish entitlement. The legal definition was crystal clear. My parents were committing federal wire fraud. The penalty for orchestrating a cyber extortion scheme of this magnitude is severe. It carries the weight of lengthy prison sentences and mandatory financial restitution. My father always believed his polished veneer and confident vocabulary made him untouchable. He assumed his sophisticated financial maneuvers were too complex for a rugged outdoor specialist to comprehend. He fundamentally underestimated the analytical discipline required to track a lost hiker through a zero-visibility blizzard. A digital ledger is just another kind of trail, and I excel at finding footprints. I began the meticulous process of archiving the crime scene. I downloaded the entire donor registry, converting the names, timestamps, and contribution amounts into a secure, comma-separated values file. I captured high-resolution images of the deceptive campaign description, ensuring the exact phrasing was preserved before they could edit or delete the page. I ran a screen recording program to document the diagnostic process, proving the direct link between the crowdfunding platform and Patricia's limited liability company. I organized the fresh evidence into the encrypted directory alongside the banking records and the counterfeit merchandise invoices. The legal binder I was constructing was growing into a lethal weapon. It was a flawless, undeniable narrative of corporate fraud and familial sociopathy. My primary duty as a rescue specialist is to protect vulnerable people from hazardous environments. Usually that involves rappelling down sheer cliffs or stabilizing broken limbs in freezing temperatures. Tonight, the hazard was my own biological family, and the vulnerable targets were the mentors and peers who had taught me how to survive. I made a silent vow to the glowing screen. I would recover every single stolen dollar and return it to the people who earned it. With the wire fraud documented, my analytical focus shifted toward the remaining corporate filings attached to Summit Elite. If my parents possessed the audacity to funnel a federal crime through their new enterprise, I needed to know what other assets were tangled in their web. A limited liability company is frequently used by predatory individuals to shield private property from creditors. I accessed the State Uniform Commercial Code Registry. This database records all secured loans and property liens filed within the jurisdiction. I typed the corporate identification number for Summit Elite into the search parameter and executed the query. The system returned a single active filing. I opened the attached portable document format and felt the air rush out of my lungs. The document was a short-term, high-interest promissory note. Richard had secured a massive line of credit using the shell company as the primary debtor. Predatory loans of this nature require substantial collateral to guarantee the aggressive interest rates. I scanned down to the section detailing the pledged assets. Listed in crisp black text was the vehicle identification number of my official wilderness response truck. It was a heavy-duty, specialized off-road vehicle. I had spent 3 years of extreme weather deployment wages customizing the suspension, reinforcing the undercarriage, and installing military-grade communication arrays. That truck was my professional lifeline. It allowed me to reach disaster zones that standard emergency vehicles could never access. The registry indicated a predatory title loan company held the official lien. If Richard defaulted on the exorbitant monthly payments, the lenders possessed the legal authority to repossess my vehicle immediately. I stared at the screen, trying to process the sheer mechanical impossibility of the transaction. In the state of Colorado, you cannot secure a title loan on a motor vehicle unless the registered owner physically signs the transfer documents in the presence of a certified notary. My name was the only one listed on the original pristine title. I scrolled to the final page of the digital filing to view the executed signature block. The ink was a flawless replication of my handwriting, but I had never signed that specific document. I had been deployed on a grueling 2-week backcountry operation when the loan was finalized. Richard had forged my signature. The rolling conflict accelerated, presenting a devastating new puzzle. A simple forgery would eventually fail under the scrutiny of a bank underwriter. Richard was arrogant, but he was not stupid. He would never risk a federal banking charge unless he possessed a foundational document that granted his forgery the illusion of absolute legality. I closed my eyes and sifted through my memory, searching for the exact moment he had acquired the leverage to steal my truck. The digital signature on the commercial registry burned a hole in my screen. In the state of Colorado, securing a high-interest title loan against a motor vehicle requires the registered owner to physically authorize the transfer in the presence of a certified notary. The predatory lending agency possessed a legally binding document featuring my exact handwriting. A simple forgery would inevitably fail under the rigorous scrutiny of a bank underwriter. Richard is an arrogant man, but he is a calculated predator. He would never risk federal banking charges without securing a foundational document to grant his actions the illusion of total legality. I closed my eyes and sifted through my memory, searching for the precise moment he acquired the leverage to steal my primary asset. The sterile scent of the hospital ward faded, replaced by the memory of crisp pine and freezing autumn air. It was late November of last year. I was standing in the kitchen of my secluded mountain cabin, preparing for a grueling 14-day deployment in the treacherous San Juan Range. A team of amateur mountaineers had vanished during an early season blizzard. The survival window was closing rapidly, and the operational stakes were profound. I had been awake for 20 straight hours, calibrating radio transceivers, organizing thermal rations, and checking medical kits. I was physically drained and operating on pure adrenaline. The sound of tires crunching on my gravel driveway broke my concentration. Richard stepped onto my muddy wooden porch, wearing a tailored wool overcoat that looked entirely absurd in the rugged environment. He carried 2 cups of artisanal coffee in a cardboard holder. It was a remarkably rare display of parental concern. He had not visited my cabin in over 8 months. He stepped inside and played the role of the anxious, protective father with cinematic perfection. He handed me a coffee and sighed heavily, looking at the extensive tactical gear spread across my kitchen island. "You are going off the grid for 2 weeks, Matilda," he said, his voice laced with practiced worry. "No cellular service, no satellite link. The weather reports look devastating. What happens if a pipe bursts here at the house? What happens if your truck registration lapses, or a utility bill triggers a shutoff while you are freezing in a tent? You need someone to manage the mundane details so you can focus on staying alive." He pulled a thick stack of legal papers from his pristine leather briefcase. He referred to the document as a routine emergency authorization. It was a limited power of attorney designed strictly for basic administrative maintenance while I was deployed in communication blackout zones. He claimed it was a standard precaution. My profound exhaustion betrayed my usually sharp instincts. My mind was entirely focused on the missing climbers and the approaching storm front. I did not read the dense legal paragraphs hidden on the second page. I did not question why the final sheet already featured a pressed notary seal, courtesy of his regular golf partner at the local bank. I simply wanted him to leave so I could finish packing my survival equipment. I accepted his expensive fountain pen and signed my name on the dotted line. I opened my eyes, returning to the harsh, fluorescent reality of the Denver Trauma Center. That single signature was the skeleton key. He weaponized my fatigue, converting a brief moment of misplaced trust into broad financial jurisdiction. The document granted him the legal authority to act as my official proxy in asset negotiations. I directed my attention back to the encrypted field terminal to scrutinize the loan specifics. The predatory lenders had issued $30,000 against the title of my customized response vehicle. However, the disbursement ledger revealed these funds did not flow into Patricia's counterfeit influencer company. The capital was routed directly to a private wealth management syndicate headquartered in downtown Denver. Richard possessed a hidden vulnerability. He maintained his luxurious country club facade by participating in high-risk commercial real estate investments. He craved the prestige of sitting at the elite investors' table, but he lacked the actual liquidity to sustain the buy-in. The real estate syndicate had issued a sudden margin call, demanding immediate capital to cover a failing commercial property venture. He needed cash instantly to prevent a humiliating public default among his wealthy peers. He looked at my customized search and rescue truck and saw nothing but a convenient poker chip to cover his gambling debts. My response truck is not a standard consumer automobile. It is a highly specialized piece of emergency machinery. I spent 3 years of extreme weather deployment wages upgrading the suspension, reinforcing the steel undercarriage, and installing independent power grids to run diagnostic medical equipment in sub-zero environments. It is my professional lifeline, allowing me to reach disaster zones that standard emergency vehicles can never access. Richard evaluated the heavy-duty winch and the customized chassis merely in terms of appraisal value. He remained blissfully ignorant of the proprietary technology hidden inside the reinforced cabin. During my second year on the mountain response team, our division lost communication with the deployed unit during a catastrophic flash blizzard. To prevent a recurrence, our regional director mandated the installation of military-grade tracking hardware in all primary response vehicles. The device is a highly classified asset. The tracker is hardwired directly into the steel frame of my truck, operating on an independent, hidden battery cell. It broadcasts a silent, encrypted geolocation signal every 60 seconds, communicating directly with an orbiting satellite network. The beacon is entirely undetectable without specialized diagnostic software. You cannot disable the signal by disconnecting the main engine battery or disabling the dashboard navigation system. Richard had no idea he had pledged a vehicle that broadcast its exact coordinates directly to my secure database. He thought he stole an expensive piece of metal to satisfy his creditors. He actually tagged himself with a permanent digital leash. The truck was a rolling surveillance device, and I possessed the only decryption key. The tactical advantage was substantial, but the legal reality remained perilous. I had successfully gathered the evidence of wire fraud, identity theft, and predatory financial exploitation. I mapped the entire architecture of their corporate sociopathy. However, possessing the truth and proving it in a court of law are two entirely different operations. I was still confined to a hospital bed with a shattered leg. My primary bank accounts were drained. My union benefits were secure, but those funds were strictly locked in an escrow account dedicated solely to my medical invoices. To execute a flawless retaliation, I needed to move beyond building a digital ledger. I needed to weaponize the paper trail. I required the services of an elite litigation attorney who understood how to freeze corporate assets, secure emergency injunctions, and dismantle fraudulent shell companies. A generic public defender or a standard family lawyer would be instantly crushed by the expensive legal team my father kept on permanent retainer. I needed a ruthless corporate litigator, the kind of professional who charges an exorbitant hourly rate to destroy financial predators. The rolling conflict presented a stark mathematical problem. How does a wounded rescue worker hire a premium attorney when her parents have systematically looted her savings and leveraged her only vehicle? I closed the commercial registry tab on the laptop. Commander Vaughn watched me from the doorway, sensing the shift in my operational focus. The room was silent, save for the steady rhythm of my heart monitor. I looked down at my bandaged hands, remembering a specific emergency protocol my grandfather had taught me years ago. He always told me a smart climber never relies on a single safety rope. You must always secure a hidden anchor. I needed to access my hidden anchor. I reached for my personal mobile phone, preparing to access the one financial asset Richard never knew existed. My maternal grandfather was a rugged, high-altitude surveyor who spent his life mapping the most dangerous ridges in the state. He possessed a profound disdain for the superficial country club lifestyle my parents worshipped. He understood my father perfectly, recognizing the hollow, predatory ambition hidden beneath the tailored suits and the least luxury sedans. Before my grandfather passed away, he established an independent, irrevocable trust in my name. The principal sum was modest by elite standards, but the legal architecture surrounding the money was impenetrable. Richard spent years attempting to crack the trust structure, claiming he could generate superior yields through his commercial real estate syndicate. The estate executor denied every request. The capital remained securely locked until my 24th birthday. I crossed that milestone just last month. I had not touched a single dollar, choosing to treat the account as a sacred reserve for future mountain property. As the sun began to rise over the snowy peaks outside my hospital window, that untouched reserve became my designated war chest. Fighting a complex financial war requires specialized tactical support. I needed legal representation capable of matching my father's ruthlessness and exceeding his arrogance. I turned to Commander Vaughn for a recommendation. He handed me a business card featuring a direct mobile number for a former search and rescue volunteer who had transitioned into corporate litigation. Her name was Evelyn. She held a fierce reputation for dismantling predatory executives in downtown Denver boardrooms. I dialed the number, half expecting a generic voicemail greeting given the early hour. Evelyn answered on the second ring. I outlined the intercepted union benefits, the fraudulent limited liability company, the stolen identity, and the forged power of attorney. She did not offer hollow pity or soft condolences. She asked for the routing numbers and quoted a formidable retainer fee. I authorized the transfer from my grandfather's trust, securing her services. 4 hours later, the heavy wooden door to the trauma ward clicked open. Evelyn walked into the room, radiating a cold, calculated authority. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a thick, reinforced leather briefcase. She possessed the sharp, evaluating gaze of an alpine predator. Commander Vaughn offered a respectful nod and stepped into the hallway to grant us attorney-client privilege. We transformed the sterile medical room into a tactical command center. I handed her the encrypted field terminal. She sat in the vinyl visitor chair and spent an hour meticulously reviewing the digital spreadsheet, the counterfeit influencer storefront, and the crowdfunding registry. When she finally looked up from the glowing screen, her expression was a mask of professional disgust. "Your father is a sloppy, arrogant thief," Evelyn stated, her voice cool and level. "He relies on the assumption that familial loyalty will prevent you from prosecuting his crimes. We are going to permanently correct that assumption today." Evelyn outlined our strategy. There would be no emotional phone calls to the ski resort in Aspen. There would be no dramatic, tearful demands for apologies or explanations. We were going to communicate through the brutal, unyielding machinery of the justice system. Preparation replaced my previous despair. We were drafting a lethal counteroffensive using pure, cold paper. First, she drafted an emergency ex parte injunction to freeze every financial asset tied to the Summit Elite Survival Preparedness Shell Company. By presenting the forged signature and the unauthorized routing requests to a sympathetic district judge, Evelyn explained we could paralyze Patricia's corporate checking account before the banking institutions opened on Monday morning. My parents would be locked out of their stolen capital, unable to process a single transaction. Next, we addressed the stolen response vehicle. Evelyn filed a formal caveat on the truck title with the Department of Motor Vehicles. This specific legal lock prevented the predatory lenders from liquidating the asset or transferring ownership. They could tow the specialized truck, but they could not legally sell it at auction. The vehicle remained suspended in a state of administrative purgatory, buying us the crucial window of time required to nullify the forged promissory note and expose the underlying fraud. The crowdfunding campaign required a different tactical approach. Evelyn contacted the Platform Compliance Division, directly bypassing their standard customer service channels. She submitted the official hospital admission records, proving the generous outdoor community donations were not reaching the trauma center billing department. She attached the incorporating documents demonstrating the illicit diversion of charitable contributions into a private event planning enterprise. The platform administrators moved with terrifying speed. They suspended the campaign, freezing the $45,000 in a secure federal holding account pending an internal fraud investigation. Sydney and Patricia could look at the glowing progress bar on their mobile screens, but they could not withdraw a single cent to pay for their luxurious spa treatments. Digital evidence is highly vulnerable to accidental deletion or technical manipulation. A physical document possesses an undeniable gravity that a computer screen cannot replicate. Evelyn instructed her paralegal to print the entire digital archive. An hour later, a courier arrived at the hospital, delivering a thick, heavy-duty binder. I spent the remainder of the afternoon assembling the physical trap. I placed the forged power of attorney in the very first section. The luxury spa receipts, the designer apparel invoices, and the Click Farm transaction records filled the second section. The counterfeit survival biography and the frozen crowdfunding registry occupied the final pages. I snapped the heavy metal rings closed. The weight of the binder resting on my lap felt profoundly grounding. It was a flawless, undeniable narrative of corporate fraud and familial sociopathy. The trap was meticulously built and primed to snap shut. The legal guillotine was hoisted into position, but a weapon requires a specific target. Evelyn warned me that civil litigation moves at a glacial pace. Filing silent injunctions behind closed doors would not deliver the immediate public accountability my family so richly deserved. They were still enjoying their pristine vacation, oblivious to the impending financial collapse hovering over their heads. To maximize the impact, I needed to deliver the heavy binder in a setting where Richard could not spin the narrative or hide his deceit from his wealthy peers. I needed a captive audience. The hospital discharge planner entered my room, interrupting our strategy session, with a clipboard in her hand. She informed me that my newly secured union insurance had cleared the final physical therapy assessment. I was scheduled for release the following morning. The reality of my physical condition crashed into the room. I was being evicted from the trauma ward with a shattered femur encased in a heavy metal leg brace. I required crutches to walk even a few painful feet. I had nowhere to go. My secluded cabin was empty and difficult to access. My customized response truck was missing, presumably hunted by aggressive repo agents. The rolling conflict presented a stark, terrifying vulnerability. I was about to be abandoned on a Denver sidewalk with limited mobility. But before the panic could fully settle in my chest, my mobile phone illuminated on the tray table. It was an automated calendar alert forwarded from Sydney's public social media profile. The notification displayed an ornate digital invitation. My parents were returning from Aspen, and they were hosting a lavish Welcome Home Hero charity gala at their exclusive country club that weekend. The stage was perfectly set. The morning sun broke through the horizontal hospital blinds, casting sharp shadows across the sterile linoleum floor. The administrative machinery of the Denver Trauma Center moved with swift efficiency now that my state union benefits guaranteed the billing ledger. A physical therapist arrived at dawn to adjust the heavy titanium brace locking my right leg into a rigid, straight line. The device was an imposing cage of metal struts and thick fabric straps designed to bear the weight my shattered femur could no longer support. He handed me a pair of standard aluminum crutches and spent an hour teaching me how to swing my body forward without jarring the bone grafts. Every movement sent a fresh wave of blinding pain radiating through my hip. When the discharge nurse finally wheeled me down to the main lobby, the physical reality of my isolation became starkly undeniable. The sliding glass doors parted, letting in a biting gust of Rocky Mountain winter air. The designated patient pickup zone was empty. There were no balloons or warm embraces. There was no pristine luxury utility vehicle idling at the curb with a worried mother inside. My parents were still enjoying their lavish vacation in Aspen 3 hours away. I stood on the freezing pavement, balancing my broken body on 2 metal sticks, waiting for my ride. A battered green station wagon pulled into the loading bay. The muffler rattled, and the roof rack was loaded with weathered climbing ropes and carabiners. Sarah, the junior wilderness paramedic who had sacrificed $50 of her meager grocery budget to my fraudulent crowdfunding campaign, shifted the vehicle into park. She stepped out into the cold, wearing a faded fleece jacket. Sarah embodies the authentic, resilient spirit of our mountain brotherhood. She works 3 grueling jobs just to afford her medical certifications. She did not ask why my wealthy parents were absent. Mountain people understand that biological ties rarely equate to actual loyalty. She simply opened the passenger door and helped me maneuver my stiff, braced leg into the cabin. The drive up the winding canyon roads was pure agony. Every pothole and uneven stretch of asphalt sent a deep, rhythmic ache through my surgical pins. Sarah kept the heater blasting and the radio volume low, offering a quiet, respectful solidarity. She mentioned the online fundraiser briefly, expressing relief that the community had rallied to support my recovery. I stared out the frost-covered window, keeping my expression neutral. I could not tell her the truth yet. I could not explain that her hard-earned $50 was currently sitting in a shell company checking account destined to pay for designer apparel and fake internet followers. I merely thanked her for her profound generosity, promising myself I would return her money the moment Evelyn executed the legal injunctions. We reached my secluded property near the tree line. The gravel driveway was desolate. My customized emergency response vehicle was gone. The parking pad where I always stored the specialized truck was covered in a fresh layer of undisturbed snow. Richard had relocated the asset. He likely moved it to a secure secondary location, assuming the predatory lenders were preparing to dispatch recovery agents. He believed he was outsmarting the repo men, protecting his poker chip before the bank could collect his collateral. He remained oblivious to the caveat Evelyn filed with the Department of Motor Vehicles, paralyzing the title. He was merely hiding a stolen object, delaying the inevitable collision. Sarah helped me ascend the 3 wooden steps leading to my front porch. The physical exertion left me breathless and shaking. She unlocked the heavy oak door, carried my small overnight bag inside, and stocked my refrigerator with a few basic groceries she had purchased on her way to the hospital. She offered to stay the afternoon, but I declined her kindness. I needed solitude to prepare the final phase of my strategy. She gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze and departed, leaving me alone in the profound silence of the empty house. I navigated toward the kitchen island, dragging the heavy titanium brace across the hardwood floor. I sat on a sturdy wooden stool, resting my crutches against the counter. The thick, reinforced binder containing the comprehensive architecture of my parents' fraud sat on the table where I had placed it before the drive home. My personal mobile phone vibrated next to the legal documents. The screen illuminated, displaying the full digital invitation packet Sydney had forwarded the previous evening. I opened the file to examine the specific details of the upcoming event. The document was a masterpiece of superficial opulence and emotional manipulation. The banner across the top read, "Welcome Home Hero, a night of healing and charity." The event was scheduled for Saturday evening at the Pine Valley Country Club. Pine Valley is an elite fortress of privilege located in the foothills. It is the type of institution that requires a 6-figure initiation fee and enforces a strict formal dress code, even in the dining hall. It represents everything I despise about their curated lifestyle. I scrolled through the itinerary. My parents were pulling out every conceivable stop to impress their affluent peers. The schedule included a champagne reception, a catered 5-course dinner, and a silent auction featuring luxury vacations and imported wines. The proceeds from the auction were allegedly earmarked for the Summit Elite Survival Preparedness Foundation. They were boldly funneling country club philanthropy directly into their fake influencer brand. The most revealing piece of intelligence was the attached guest list. Richard had invited the exact members of the commercial real estate syndicate he owed money to. The entire gala was a highly calculated performance. He was using my shattered femur as a theatrical prop to generate sympathy and buy grace from his wealthy creditors. He intended to stand at a polished podium holding a crystal glass and play the role of the devoted, suffering patriarch. He assumed I would either stay hidden in my cabin out of embarrassment or attend the event and play the compliant, grateful daughter. He relied on my lifelong habit of enduring their disrespect in silence to ensure the performance went smoothly. I stared at the glossy digital invitation, feeling a cold, sharp focus settle over my exhaustion. They had built a magnificent stage for their own vanity. They gathered the very investors and socialites they desperately wanted to impress into a single, opulent room. They had handed me a microphone and an audience. I reached across the kitchen island and unzipped the protective canvas garment bag hanging on the back of the pantry door. Inside was my official Wilderness Search and Rescue Class A uniform. It consisted of a dark navy button-down shirt with my name and medical credentials embroidered above the left breast pocket and rugged, reinforced tactical trousers. The fabric was stiff and smelled faintly of pine resin and antiseptic. It was the uniform we wore to formal unit ceremonies and public safety briefings. It was not a designer gown. It did not belong in a country club ballroom. It was the undeniable physical embodiment of the reality my family was desperately trying to sanitize. I hung the uniform next to the heavy legal binder. The trap was ready. The evidence was irrefutable. The venue was secured. I had the legal injunctions, the frozen crowdfunding registries, the counterfeit merchandise supply chains, and the forged power of attorney, all neatly indexed and tabbed. I was prepared to walk into that velvet-lined fortress and systematically dismantle their social and financial standing in front of every single person they valued. But a seasoned investigator knows that a cornered target will look for any available exit route. Richard was arrogant, but his decision to hide my customized response truck indicated a rising panic regarding his debts. I needed to know exactly where he parked my vehicle. If he managed to sell it to an underground buyer or strip the expensive medical arrays before the DMV caveat finalized, I would lose my most vital professional asset. As I reached for a glass of water, my phone emitted a sharp, distinct chime that sounded nothing like a standard text message or calendar alert. I opened the secure application folder on my home screen. The icon for the classified tracking software flashed with a bright, urgent red indicator. The military-grade geolocation beacon, hardwired into the steel chassis of my missing truck, had just triggered an unexpected proximity alert. The vehicle was not sitting idle in a hidden storage facility. The engine was running, and the truck was moving. I watched the digital map render on the screen, tracking the precise coordinates of the stolen asset as it navigated the winding mountain roads. The rolling conflict was accelerating again. My father was driving the physical evidence of his forgery directly toward his own destruction. The blinking red indicator on my secure mobile application pulsed with a steady, rhythmic glow. I sat on the wooden stool in my kitchen, watching the digital map render the winding alpine roads. The classified military-grade geolocation beacon, hardwired into the steel chassis of my wilderness response vehicle, was transmitting a flawless signal. The truck was moving south, away from the secluded storage units near the county line, and descending toward the foothills. Evelyn, my corporate litigation attorney, had filed the official caveat on the vehicle title late Friday afternoon. That legal lock paralyzed the predatory lenders, preventing them from liquidating the asset. However, standard banking procedure dictates that a paralyzed title triggers an immediate default protocol. The lending agency undoubtedly sent a repossession notice directly to my father's registered email address at dawn. Richard was experiencing the terrifying collapse of his financial mirage. He knew the recovery agents were actively hunting his collateral. My father operates on a framework of optics and social preservation. If a battered tow truck arrived at his pristine suburban driveway to drag away a mud-covered rescue vehicle, his neighbors would witness the humiliating spectacle. He needed to hide the truck to buy time. He assumed he could negotiate a temporary extension with his commercial real estate syndicate during the charity gala later tonight. He just needed to stash the vehicle somewhere secure until Monday morning. I traced the digital breadcrumbs trailing across my screen. The red dot merged onto the interstate, heading toward the affluent suburbs. I anticipated he might abandon the vehicle in a long-term airport garage or a subterranean corporate parking deck. Instead, the signal veered off the main highway and navigated the manicured private access roads of the Pine Valley District. The blinking indicator crossed the digital perimeter of the Pine Valley Country Club. It slowed to a crawl, winding past the sprawling golf courses and the tennis pavilions, before finally halting in the designated very important person parking sector. The engine telemetry data transmitted a final shutdown code. The truck was parked. The strategic irony was profound. Richard sought a fortress to protect his stolen poker chip. The country club employs a notoriously strict private security force. A standard repossession agent cannot simply breach the gated perimeter and tow a vehicle from the elite parking zone without triggering a high-profile disruption. My father believed he had discovered the perfect, secure hiding place. He failed to realize he had just delivered the primary physical evidence of his forgery directly to the venue of his upcoming social execution. The afternoon sun shifted, casting long shadows across my kitchen island. The gala commenced in 4 hours. I needed to transform myself from a wounded patient into a tactical operative. The physical reality of my shattered femur demanded meticulous planning. I stood up, gripping the aluminum crutches. The heavy titanium brace locked my right leg into a rigid pillar. Every step required calculated effort, sending sharp, localized ache through my bone grafts. I maneuvered into the bathroom to prepare for the deployment. I washed my face using a cold, damp washcloth, avoiding the sensitive frostbitten skin on my cheeks. I dressed in my official Wilderness Search and Rescue Class A uniform. The dark navy fabric felt like armor. I fastened the buttons over my chest, ensuring the embroidered medical credentials and my unit insignia were displayed prominently. I did not apply cosmetic enhancements. I did not attempt to style my hair into an elegant country club aesthetic. I pulled my hair back into a tight, functional braid. The contrast between my rugged, authentic appearance and the curated opulence of the impending gala would serve as a psychological weapon. I returned to the kitchen and assessed the heavy, reinforced binder resting on the counter. The legal injunctions, the corporate ledgers, the fraudulent crowdfunding registries, and the forged promissory note were securely indexed inside. I slid the thick binder into a dark canvas messenger bag and slung the strap diagonally across my chest. The added weight threw off my precarious balance, forcing my uninjured leg to compensate for the shifting center of gravity. I could not drive. My left foot was functional, but operating a motor vehicle with a braced femur is a logistical impossibility. I accessed a premium private car service application on my phone. I requested a sleek black sedan, bypassing the standard rideshare options. I needed a vehicle that would blend seamlessly into the procession of luxury cars arriving at the Pine Valley gates. A standard compact car would draw immediate scrutiny from the security detail, complicating my infiltration. The black sedan arrived 20 minutes later. The driver stepped out, evaluating my crutches and my uniform with silent, professional curiosity. He opened the rear door and assisted me as I awkwardly slid onto the leather seat, keeping my rigid leg extended. I provided the destination. He nodded and steered the vehicle down the mountain. The drive took 45 minutes. I watched the rugged alpine landscape transition into pristine, manicured wealth. We passed towering iron gates and sprawling estates. My pulse maintained a slow, steady rhythm. I was entering hostile territory. Pine Valley was the cradle of my parents' elite obsession. I remembered being a teenager wearing worn hiking boots while Sydney paraded around the clubhouse in designer tennis skirts. The members of this club worship prestigious titles. They revere medical degrees and corporate partnerships while treating grueling physical labor as a quaint novelty. My parents had always weaponized this environment to make me feel inadequate. They assumed the intimidating atmosphere of the club would deter me from ever challenging their authority. They were about to discover that a woman who routinely scales freezing rock faces is not intimidated by crystal chandeliers and expensive champagne. The sedan approached the main entrance of the country club. 2 private security guards stood beneath a stone archway checking names against a digital registry on their tablet devices. The rolling conflict presented a new immediate barrier. My name was explicitly omitted from the official guest list. Richard and Patricia had no intention of allowing the actual subject of their charity gala to wander in and ruin their curated narrative. They assumed my physical injuries would keep me confined to my cabin, silent and compliant. The driver rolled down my window as the guard approached. The guard peered into the back seat, his eyes scanning my official search and rescue uniform. He noticed the heavy titanium brace and the crutches resting against the door panel. I maintained a cold, authoritative posture. "I am Matilda Hayes," I stated, my voice projected with calm precision. "The guest of honor. My parents are hosting the recovery benefit inside." The guard checked his tablet. He frowned, noticing the discrepancy, but his social conditioning overrode his administrative protocol. Refusing entry to a uniformed, wounded first responder arriving at her own designated charity event would trigger a public relations disaster. He pressed the button, raising the heavy wooden gate and waving the vehicle through the checkpoint. The sedan rolled up the sweeping circular driveway toward the grand clubhouse. As we bypassed the valet station, I glanced toward the exclusive parking sector. Sitting between a pristine silver sports car and a luxury imported sedan was my battered, mud-covered wilderness response truck. It looked beautifully disruptive. Richard had parked it near the exit, hoping for a quick escape if the creditors tracked him down. I instructed my driver to halt near the main portico. I gathered my canvas messenger bag and gripped my aluminum crutches. The digital hunt was over. The physical confrontation had arrived. I prepared to breach the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, knowing the moment I crossed that threshold, the illusion my family had spent decades building would shatter into pieces. The only remaining challenge was navigating the opulent crowd and securing the microphone before my parents realized the architect of their destruction was already inside the room. Inside the grand ballroom of the Pine Valley Country Club, the atmosphere reeked of manufactured empathy. A towering ice sculpture shaped like an alpine peak melted slowly near a lavish caviar station. My father stood behind a polished mahogany podium, adjusting the lapels of his bespoke tuxedo. A crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow over the assembled crowd. He looked out at the faces of his commercial real estate syndicate partners. These were the wealthy executives who held his financial survival in their manicured hands. Richard gripped the edges of the lectern, leaning into the microphone. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of profound paternal sorrow. He spun a masterful fiction for his captive audience. He described the terrifying phone call he allegedly received the night the mountain collapsed, burying his eldest child under tons of packed snow. He detailed the agonizing hours spent pacing the waiting room floor while trauma surgeons operated. He conveniently omitted the fact that he was actually enjoying a deep tissue basalt stone therapy session 3 hours away in Aspen. He claimed he had liquidated personal assets to ensure I received the finest orthopedic care available. He painted a heartbreaking portrait of a frail, resting daughter confined to a dark room, struggling to heal in quiet isolation. The affluent guests nodded with solemn approval, raising their expensive champagne flutes in a silent tribute to his incredible sacrifice. Outside the heavy oak doors of the banquet hall, the reality of his fiction was currently navigating the grand foyer. The lobby featured imported Italian marble floors polished to a mirror finish. Every step I took created a sharp, echoing percussion. The rubber tips of my aluminum crutches struck the hard stone. Clack. The heavy titanium brace encasing my shattered femur dragged forward. Scrape. Clack. Scrape. The rhythmic metallic sound resonated through the vaulted ceiling, cutting through the soft string quartet music drifting from the ballroom. I bypassed the coat check attendant, ignoring his bewildered stare. My dark canvas messenger bag containing the lethal legal execution documents swung heavily against my hip. My parents always despised the physical evidence of my profession. They viewed dirt, sweat, and calloused hands as markers of a lower-class existence. They surrounded themselves with people who inherited their fortunes or earned them through abstract digital trades. Pine Valley represented the pinnacle of their prestige-obsessed culture, a world where curated appearance dictated human value. Richard was currently utilizing that exact cultural currency to buy grace from his creditors. He gestured toward my younger sister Sydney, who sat at the head table, wiping away a perfectly timed tear. He praised her resilience, telling the investors she had selflessly set aside her own burgeoning outdoor lifestyle brand to support her injured sibling. Clack, scrape. I reached the final stretch of the ornate corridor. 2 uniformed catering staff members carrying silver trays stepped aside, pressing their backs against the flocked wallpaper to grant me passage. My official Wilderness Search and Rescue Class A uniform contrasted sharply with the surrounding aesthetic. The dark navy fabric was worn at the elbows from years of hauling safety lines. My boots bore the permanent scuff marks of jagged granite and frozen mud. I did not belong in this velvet-lined fortress, and that was precisely the source of my tactical power. I was the undeniable physical truth, marching steadily toward their fragile house of cards. The audience inside the room continued to weep over a phantom, while the genuine article prepared to breach the perimeter. Richard reached the soaring crescendo of his fabricated emotional appeal. He raised his crystal glass, proposing a toast to family loyalty and the healing power of community generosity. The guests murmured their agreement, lifting their beverages in unison. I reached the ornate brass handles of the double doors. I shifted my weight onto my uninjured left leg, freeing one hand to grip the heavy metal latch. I pushed downward with steady force. The heavy oak panels swung inward with a prolonged, dramatic groan. The soft, golden glow of the ballroom spilled out into the hallway, and the harsh reality of the hallway bled into the pristine gala. The timing was immaculate. My entrance severed the quiet reverence of the room. The string quartet seated near the grand staircase faltered, hitting a discordant, sour note before falling entirely silent. Dozens of heads turned simultaneously toward the entryway. The guests expected to see a tardy investor or a bustling banquet manager. Instead, they beheld a rugged, battered rescue specialist leaning heavily on medical equipment. The visual juxtaposition was jarring. The affluent crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide, unobstructed path directly down the center of the room. The silence was thick and suffocating. At the front of the hall, Richard stood frozen behind the podium. His crystal flute hovered inches from his mouth. The vibrant color drained rapidly from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor beneath his practiced artificial tan. He stared at the imposing titanium cage bolted to my right leg and the dark canvas bag slung across my chest. His fabricated narrative regarding a frail, bedridden daughter shattered the instant the crowd registered my rigid posture. Sitting at the front table, my mother Patricia dropped her linen napkin. Her meticulously curated composure disintegrated into raw panic. Sydney stared at my official uniform, the very identity she had stolen for her counterfeit enterprise, with wide, terrified eyes. I did not pause at the threshold. I adjusted my grip on the aluminum handles and resumed my deliberate march. Clack. Scrape. The rhythmic sound was no longer muffled by the heavy doors. It echoed loud and clear across the vast banquet hall, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and the towering ice sculptures. The wealthy investors tracked my progress, their expressions shifting from polite confusion to profound shock. They recognized my face from the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign displayed on the large projection screens behind the stage. Yet my rugged, defiant posture contradicted the helpless victim profile Richard had just finished describing to them. I looked directly at my father, maintaining a cold, steady gaze. I was 50 feet away from the microphone. My objective was the wooden podium. I needed to open the heavy legal binder and broadcast the irrefutable truth to the entire commercial syndicate. I needed to read the wire fraud evidence, the forged promissory note, and the luxury spa receipts into the public record. Richard recognized the lethal threat approaching his stage. He possessed no verbal defense to deploy. The predatory patriarch was trapped in his own snare, staring at the consequences of his arrogance. Patricia is a woman who thrives on social manipulation and behavioral control. She realized that allowing me to reach the amplification system would guarantee their total financial and social ruin. The elite investors would demand immediate answers if they heard the truth. My mother pushed her dining chair back so forcefully it tipped over, striking the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. She abandoned her glass of wine and sprinted across the ballroom, intercepting my path. Her fake, sympathetic smile stretched tight across her face, masking a desperate, venomous intent. She intended to flank me, grab my arm, and drag me into the adjacent private catering corridor before I could utter a single word to the bewildered crowd. The tactical infiltration was a flawless success, but the intense physical and social confrontation had just been initiated. I tightened my grip on the crutches, preparing to hold my ground against her assault. My mother, Patricia, moved across the polished dance floor with a frantic, desperate energy. She navigated the maze of round dining tables and seated guests. Her silk designer gown rustled against the chair legs. Patricia views public composure as the ultimate measure of a person's worth. In her affluent circles, a family can harbor profound dark secrets as long as they never allow those secrets to spill out into the daylight of a catered reception. To her, my official rescue uniform was not a symbol of public service. It was a filthy, unsanctioned disruption. She intended to neutralize the threat before the commercial real estate investors realized the carefully constructed narrative was a fraud. She intercepted my path near the center of the ballroom. Her expensive floral perfume washed over me, a sharp contrast to the sterile antiseptic smell still clinging to my skin. She reached out with her right hand, attempting to seize my bicep and drag me toward the shadowed alcove near the kitchen service doors. Her face was contorted into a rigid, terrifying smile, designed to reassure the watching guests. "Matilda, what on earth are you doing here?" she hissed. Her voice a harsh, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "You are ruining the evening. Turn around right now and go to the catering hall before you humiliate your father." A month ago, I might have obeyed that command. I spent my entire life shrinking myself to accommodate their fragile egos. I endured their endless critiques and their blatant favoritism toward Sydney to maintain a fragile peace. But the woman they abandoned in the Denver Trauma Center no longer existed. The avalanche had crushed my femur, but it had also shattered my conditioned compliance. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or offer an explanation. I simply planted my left aluminum crutch firmly against the Italian marble floor and pivoted my weight. I stepped out of her reach with cold, calculated precision. Her manicured fingers grasped empty air. She stumbled slightly, her high-heeled shoes slipping on the polished stone. The physical evasion was minimal, but the social rejection was profound. Several affluent guests seated at the nearest table gasped in surprise, witnessing the golden hostess lose her balance and her composure. I adjusted my grip on the canvas messenger bag carrying the legal injunctions and resumed my march toward the front of the room. Clack. Scrape. The heavy titanium brace dragged across the floor. I left Patricia standing alone in the center of the ballroom, her fake smile evaporating into a mask of pure terror. I approached the elevated stage. The small set of wooden stairs presented a formidable physical obstacle for a shattered leg. I paused at the base, gathering my strength. The elite crowd watched my every movement in stunned silence. The string quartet remained frozen with their bows resting across their instruments. Richard was trapped behind the mahogany podium. He watched me ascend the stairs one agonizing step at a time. He possessed a brief window of opportunity to control the impending collision. He relied on his greatest weapon, which was his undeniable charisma. He forced a broad, artificial grin onto his face and leaned into the microphone to address the bewildered investors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice dripping with forced joviality. "It appears we have a surprise guest of honor. My brave daughter has found the strength to join us tonight. Let us give her a warm Pine Valley welcome." He initiated a round of polite, hesitant applause. A few guests clapped their hands, unsure of the unfolding dynamic. Richard stepped away from the lectern, extending his arms as if preparing to embrace me in a warm, paternal hug. He intended to wrap his arms around my shoulders, whisper a threat into my ear, and guide me away from the amplification system. I reached the top of the stairs and stopped. I fixed him with a stare so cold and unyielding, it halted his progress instantly. He recognized the look. It was the same expression I used when evaluating a dangerous, unstable rock face before a tactical descent. He lowered his arms, his artificial grin faltering. He took a slow, cautious step backward, yielding the primary position. I walked directly to the microphone. The brass gooseneck stand was positioned too high for my current stance. I reached up and adjusted the angle. The movement produced a short, sharp whine of audio feedback that echoed through the vast banquet hall. The piercing sound severed the remaining polite applause, silencing the room entirely. I looked out over the sea of tailored suits and glittering diamond necklaces. I saw the faces of the commercial real estate syndicate, the men who held my father's financial survival in their ledgers. I saw Sydney sitting at the head table, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the pristine white tablecloth. I saw Patricia lingering near the center of the floor, unable to retreat and unable to intervene. The stage was mine. The audience was captive. The heavy canvas bag rested against my hip, holding the irrefutable evidence of their corporate fraud. I did not shout. I did not let a single trace of anger seep into my vocal delivery. A rescue commander never yells during a crisis because panic is contagious. You project steady, undeniable authority to command the environment. I inhaled a deep breath of the conditioned ballroom air and leaned into the microphone. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate my survival," I began. My tone was chillingly polite, stripped of any warmth or familial affection. The acoustics of the ballroom carried my voice to the farthest corners of the room, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers and the towering ice sculptures. My parents have spent the evening telling you how difficult my week in the trauma center was. I continued keeping my pace deliberate and even. They described the agonizing hours they spent pacing the hospital waiting room. They told you they sacrificed everything to ensure my recovery. I paused, letting the words hang in the silent air. The wealthy investors nodded slowly, expecting a traditional speech of gratitude. I scanned the front row, locking eyes with the primary stakeholder of Richard's commercial syndicate. "What they have not told you," I said, my voice dropping an octave, "is that they spent that entire week at a 5-star spa in Aspen." The room fell dead silent. The silence was not the polite quiet of an attentive audience. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that follows a sudden atmospheric pressure drop. It was the sound of a carefully curated illusion fracturing into 1,000 jagged pieces. A woman seated near the front row let out a sharp, audible gasp, dropping her silver dessert fork onto her china plate with a loud clatter. The syndicate investors stopped nodding. They turned their heads, looking from my rugged, battered uniform to Richard's pale, sweating face. They were men who built their fortunes on risk assessment and pattern recognition. They instantly recognized the stark visual discrepancy between the devoted patriarch Richard claimed to be and the discarded, wounded first responder standing before them. Richard stepped forward, his hands trembling. "Matilda, please," he stammered, his voice thin and desperate without the amplification of the microphone. "You are confused. The pain medication is clouding your memory. We were there for you." He was attempting to gaslight me in front of 200 witnesses. He wanted to paint me as a hysterical, heavily medicated patient to discredit the impending revelation. He needed the investors to believe my statements were the result of trauma-induced delirium. The rolling conflict demanded an immediate escalation. A verbal accusation can be debated or dismissed. A documented financial ledger is bulletproof. I reached into the dark canvas messenger bag, unfastening the heavy brass clasps. It was time to shift from a spoken narrative to the brutal, unyielding machinery of cold paper. I prepared to read the exact dollar amounts of their vanity into the public record. I rested my left hand on the polished mahogany lectern to steady my precarious balance. With my right hand, I unfastened the brass buckles of the dark canvas messenger bag hanging against my hip. I reached inside the heavy fabric and retrieved the reinforced legal binder. I dropped it onto the wooden podium. The thick thud resonated through the amplification system, echoing across the grand banquet hall. I flipped the heavy vinyl cover open. The sharp snap of the metal rings unlocking sounded like a rifle shot cutting through the quiet room. Richard stood mere feet away on the elevated stage. He raised his hands with his palms facing outward, adopting a posture of defensive pacification. He attempted a soft, nervous chuckle. He looked desperately toward the front dining table, where the primary stakeholders of his commercial real estate syndicate sat. These men built their vast empires by evaluating risk and detecting deception. They pride themselves on their philanthropic endeavors, routinely funding hospital wings and university libraries to secure their prestigious legacies. They possess a zero-tolerance policy for grifters who exploit genuine tragedy for personal gain. They watched my father squirm, their expressions hardening into rigid masks of critical judgment. I turned to the first indexed section of the legal portfolio. My frostbitten fingers traced the edge of the printed spreadsheet. I did not look at my parents. I addressed the elite audience, directly projecting my voice with calm, unwavering authority. My father just stood before you and claimed he liquidated his personal assets to fund my orthopedic care. I said, my voice steady and clear. He told you he endured sleepless nights praying for my recovery while navigating a profound financial burden. Let us examine the actual, documented timeline of his paternal devotion. I looked down at the crisp white paper resting on the lectern. On Monday morning at 8 o'clock, a rescue helicopter delivered me to the Denver Trauma Center. I was suffering from severe hypothermia and a shattered femur. At exactly noon, orthopedic surgeons began a grueling 6-hour procedure to insert titanium rods into my leg. I paused, letting the grim reality of the medical emergency settle over the opulent crowd. The contrast between my brutal alpine reality and their velvet-lined fortress was stark. I shifted my finger to the adjacent column on the ledger. At 1 p.m, while I was unconscious under heavy anesthesia, a direct deposit arrived from the Wilderness Search and Rescue Union. It was a catastrophic injury payout designed specifically to cover my emergency surgeries. 10 minutes later, a withdrawal was executed from that exact account. I raised my eyes to meet the piercing gaze of the lead syndicate investor seated in the front row. $2,000 was routed to an exclusive Alpine outfitter in Aspen, I read, reading the data with clinical precision. The vendor receipt indicates the purchase of designer winter apparel and imported cashmere accessories. My sister Sydney required appropriate, pristine attire to pose for photographs on the luxury lodge balcony. Sydney gasped loudly from her seat at the head table. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, her flawless socialite facade cracking under the unbearable weight of public exposure. Richard stepped toward the podium, his polished leather shoes squeaking against the hardwood stage. "Now hold on a second, Matilda," he stammered, his voice lacking the smooth baritone confidence he wielded minutes earlier. "You are misinterpreting standard administrative transfers. The union funds were delayed in transit. We used our own private capital to secure your hospital room. We were merely reimbursing ourselves for out-of-pocket expenses." I ignored his desperate fabrication. I did not engage in a petty debate. I simply turned the page, slicing through his hollow excuses with the undeniable weapon of the financial ledger. A seasoned tracker relies on the physical trail left in the dirt, not the desperate lies of a cornered target. On Tuesday morning, I underwent a secondary surgical operation. I continued maintaining my cold vocal delivery. The doctors performed an extensive bone graft, taking healthy tissue from my hip to rebuild the missing sections of my femur. The physical agony was indescribable. I dragged my finger down the printed spreadsheet, stopping at the corresponding timestamp. On Tuesday, during my bone graft, $4,000 of my hazard pay was withdrawn for a champagne brunch, I stated. The transaction included an itemized gratuity for a private sommelier consultation, followed by a suite of deep tissue basalt stone therapies at a 5-star spa. The silence in the ballroom morphed into something palpable and heavy. The syndicate investors who had raised their expensive crystal glasses to my father's fabricated martyrdom just moments ago now stared at him with undisguised disgust. A prominent local philanthropist, seated near the towering ice sculpture, shook her head, muttering a harsh condemnation under her breath. They realized they were attending a vanity project, funded entirely by the physical suffering of a first responder. Richard tugged at the starched collar of his bespoke tuxedo. Beads of perspiration formed along his hairline, catching the bright glare of the stage lights. He looked frantically around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face, but he found only rigid posture and glaring eyes. The men he desperately needed to impress were mentally recalculating his corporate value. A man willing to steal emergency medical funds from his injured child to buy imported caviar is not a man you trust with a commercial real estate portfolio. His carefully curated social currency was plummeting into a rapid freefall. "Please, my father," pleaded, his voice cracking as the panic settled deep in his chest. He gestured toward the audience with shaking hands. "This is a private family misunderstanding. My daughter has suffered a traumatic injury. She acquired these documents illegally. They are fabricated records." I reached into the binder and extracted a transparent plastic sleeve. Inside the protective cover was a certified copy of the Joint Banking Authorization Form bearing his original signature alongside the digital wire transfer receipts provided by the Union Trust Coordinator. I held the document up high, ensuring the front rows could see the official state seals. "These are verified routing records secured directly from the State Employee Benefits Registry," I corrected him, my tone dropping into a lethal register. The Denver Hospital Billing Department never received a single cent of my hazard pay. You intercepted the capital. You diverted the funds. You financed this entire Aspen vacation using the money I earned pulling stranded climbers out of freezing ravines. Patricia remained frozen near the center of the dance floor. Her expensive floral perfume could not mask the stench of her ruined reputation. She gripped the curved back of an empty dining chair, her knuckles stark white against the dark mahogany wood. The elite society she worshipped was currently witnessing her unmasking. She was no longer the devoted, wealthy matriarch holding her family together through a tragic crisis. She was exposed as a parasitic opportunist, feeding off the blood of her own kin. I placed the certified routing records back onto the podium. The tactical demolition of their personal finances was complete. I had successfully proved they stole my union benefits to fund their luxury lifestyle. My physical stamina was draining fast. The heavy titanium brace dug into my thigh, and my shoulders ached from supporting my weight on the aluminum crutches. But the rolling conflict of this war required a final, devastating strike. Exposing their theft of my personal hazard pay destroyed their social standing. Exposing their theft of the country club community's capital would invite federal prosecution. I closed the financial ledger section of the binder and placed my bandaged hand on the next index tab. The ambient noise in the banquet hall was a low, buzzing murmur of shocked whispers and sharp judgments. I tapped the brass microphone stand to command their attention one more time. My parents' theft of my medical funds is a private disgrace, I announced, my voice echoing over the hushed crowd. It highlights their profound lack of basic human decency. But stealing from a daughter is merely a moral failing. The reason I came here tonight, the reason I stand before you in this uniform, is because their greed did not stop with my bank account. I looked at the affluent guests, the local politicians, and the wealthy philanthropists who had eagerly written checks to support the evening charity auction. I saw their designer suits and their glittering diamond jewelry. They did not just steal from me, I said, letting the cold truth settle over the room. They stole from you. I opened the final section of the legal portfolio, revealing the printed digital archives of Patricia's fraudulent limited liability company and the frozen crowdfunding registry. The audience leaned forward in their seats, their previous disgust transforming into a sharp, dangerous curiosity. The trap had closed firmly on my parents, but the heavy blade was just about to fall. The phrase hung in the conditioned air of the ballroom. They stole from you. The wealthy investors and local philanthropists shifted in their upholstered chairs. The dynamic of the room transformed in an instant. A moment ago, they were affluent spectators witnessing a tragic familial dispute. Now, they were active victims in a financial crime. The polite sympathy vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating anger. Men who manage billion-dollar commercial real estate portfolios do not tolerate being treated as gullible marks by a country club grifter. I turned to the final index tab in my reinforced binder. I extracted a stack of printed donor registries and held the pages up to the bright stage lights. 3 days ago, a public crowdfunding campaign appeared on a prominent internet platform, I explained. The title requested urgent financial assistance for a wounded search and rescue hero. The campaign featured a photograph of me covered in mud and exhaustion, taken after a grueling 3-day deployment 2 winters ago. The description claimed my family was facing insurmountable medical debt and begged the community to help cover my specialized rehabilitation. I scanned the audience. Many of you sitting in this room tonight clicked that link. You wrote generous checks, believing you were funding my orthopedic surgeries. You are not the only ones. The dedicated men and women of my mountain response unit also donated. Junior paramedics surrendered their weekly grocery budgets. Veteran avalanche forecasters gave whatever they could spare from their modest bank accounts. I looked down at the spreadsheet. In less than 48 hours, the campaign raised $45,000. A murmur of approval rippled through the back rows where a few country club board members sat. They still believed the narrative of charitable success. I waited a beat before delivering the fatal correction. Not a single cent of that $45,000 went to the Denver Hospital billing department. I stated, my voice cutting through the ambient noise like a scalpel. I set the donor registry down and picked up a certified state corporate filing. The paper bore the official digital seal of the Colorado Department of Revenue. Crowdfunding platforms require a verified banking destination to release accumulated capital. I continued. The routing numbers attached to the campaign do not point to my medical escrow account. They route directly into the checking account of a newly established limited liability company called Summit Elite Survival Preparedness. The registered owner of this corporate entity is my mother, Patricia. The affluent crowd turned their collective gaze toward the center of the dance floor. Patricia stood frozen, her manicured hands gripping the back of an empty wooden chair. Her carefully preserved socialite status crumbled under the weight of hundreds of accusing eyes. I did not allow the audience to formulate their own assumptions. I mapped out the exact architecture of the fraud, ensuring no room remained for deniability or spin. Summit Elite is not a charitable foundation, I explained. It is a commercial electronic storefront. It sells cheap imported tactical merchandise to tourists. But a brand requires an authentic face to generate sales. My parents used the stolen charity funds to purchase thousands of artificial internet followers. They manufactured a fake influencer persona. I pointed my finger toward the head table. Sydney shrank back in her seat, crossing her arms in a vain attempt to hide the expensive designer apparel she wore. My younger sister, Sydney, serves as the face of this fraudulent enterprise, I said, my tone remaining detached and analytical. They took the harrowing details of my actual mountain rescue operations and pasted her smiling face over my labor. They used the money you donated to buy her pristine winter clothing for a curated photo shoot. They monetized my shattered leg to launch a counterfeit lifestyle brand. The silence shattered. A cacophony of gasps and harsh whispers erupted across the banquet hall. The syndicate investors whispered urgently to their spouses. A prominent local judge seated near the ice sculpture stood up, tossing his linen napkin onto his plate in profound disgust. Richard leaned over the polished mahogany podium, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of the wood. "Matilda, stop this right now," he pleaded, his voice strained and breathy. "You are destroying everything we have built." I ignored his desperate command. I had one final layer of deceit to expose, the crowning insult to the elite society they worshipped. "The deception extends to the very room we are standing in," I announced, raising my voice just enough to overpower the rising hum of the angry crowd. "Look at the towering ice sculptures. Look at the imported caviar and the expensive champagne you are currently drinking. This entire charity gala was marketed as a benefit for my recovery. The silent auction proceeds are supposedly earmarked for my rehabilitation." I held up the corporate ledgers detailing the event planning expenditures. My parents did not possess the personal liquidity to host an event of this magnitude, I revealed. The catering invoices, the floral arrangements, and the ballroom rental fees were all paid using the diverted charity capital. You are attending a party funded by stolen donations. My parents are laundering your charitable contributions through a country club gala to impress their real estate creditors. The revelation was the final lethal strike. The room erupted. The polite veneer of Pine Valley society dissolved into raw, chaotic outrage. Wealthy donors demanded answers. The lead investor of the commercial real estate syndicate stood up and turned his back on my father, initiating a silent, brutal exodus. Several other executives followed his lead, walking toward the coat check without saying a single word. Richard watched his financial survival walk out the heavy oak doors. His commercial empire was evaporating in real time. The public execution was complete. The verbal testimony had achieved its maximum tactical impact. I closed the thick legal binder and slid it back into my dark canvas messenger bag. I reached for my aluminum crutches, bracing them against my rib cage. I shifted my weight, favoring my uninjured leg, and navigated the small wooden stairs descending from the elevated stage. I walked toward Richard. He stepped out from behind the podium, his posture hunched and defeated. The arrogant, confident patriarch was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified man facing total ruin. He reached out a trembling hand as if he expected me to offer a sudden reprieve or a private familial compromise. I did not offer comfort. I reached inside the front pocket of my messenger bag and retrieved a thick manila envelope. The exterior bore the crisp letterhead of Evelyn, my corporate litigation attorney. I thrust the heavy paper package into his waiting hand. He looked down at the envelope, confusion mingling with the sheer panic in his eyes. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper against the backdrop of the furious murmuring crowd. I maintained a cold, steady gaze, refusing to break eye contact. "That envelope contains an emergency ex parte injunction," I explained, my words clipped and precise. "A district judge approved it late yesterday afternoon. The corporate checking accounts for Summit Elite are frozen. The personal joint accounts you use to launder the union payout are frozen. You cannot withdraw a single dollar." Richard swallowed hard, his throat working dryly. "The second document is an official caveat filed with the Department of Motor Vehicles." I continued, "I know you used a forged power of attorney to secure a predatory title loan against my customized response truck. The title is now legally paralyzed. You cannot sell the vehicle to cover your margins, and the bank cannot auction it. You are trapped with the debt." Patricia slowly approached us from the dance floor, her expensive heels dragging across the marble. She looked at the envelope in my father's hand as if it were a venomous snake. "The final document is a copy of a formal report I filed this morning," I said, delivering the fatal blow. My attorney submitted the digital crowdfunding registries, the counterfeit supply chain invoices, and the forged signature to the federal authorities. We initiated a comprehensive investigation for wire fraud and identity theft. Richard staggered back a fraction of an inch, his shoulders collapsing under the invisible weight of impending federal prosecution. He looked at me, searching my face for any lingering trace of the obedient, silent daughter he had controlled for 24 years. He found nothing but the unyielding discipline of a rescue specialist evaluating a neutralized hazard. "Matilda, please, Patricia," sobbed, her fake composure finally breaking into genuine, pathetic weeping. "We are your family. We can fix this. We can pay the money back." I adjusted my grip on the metal crutches securing my balance for the long walk back down the marble corridor. I looked at the two strangers standing before me. "You are locked out," I stated, my voice carrying the finality of a closing vault door. "We are no longer family. We are just a plaintiff and a defendant." I turned my back on the wreckage of their opulent lives. The crowd parted silently to let me pass, offering no resistance and no hollow sympathies. I marched toward the exit, leaving the velvet-lined fortress behind me. The heavy oak doors stood open. The crisp, freezing air of the Rocky Mountains drifted into the stale lobby, welcoming me back to the authentic, unforgiving world where I truly belonged. The weeks following the charity gala moved with the relentless efficiency of a synchronized avalanche. The United States District Attorney for the District of Colorado did not view the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign as a simple family dispute over mismanaged funds. Federal prosecutors evaluate wire fraud across state lines with cold mathematical precision. Evelyn, my corporate litigator, handed the comprehensive digital ledger over to the federal investigators on Monday morning. The evidence was bulletproof. Richard and Patricia had routed interstate digital commerce through a fraudulent shell company to finance personal luxury expenditures. The authorities presented my parents with a stark binary choice. They could face a lengthy public trial resulting in mandatory federal prison sentences, or they could accept a brutal, unyielding plea agreement. My father spent his entire adult life cultivating an illusion of immense wealth and untouchable prestige. The legal settlement shattered that illusion into microscopic fragments. To avoid a federal indictment for wire fraud and identity theft, the court required immediate and full financial restitution. Richard was forced to liquidate his remaining legitimate assets. The commercial real estate syndicate formally expelled him, invoking a strict morality clause buried in their partnership contract. The sudden loss of his primary income stream triggered a cascade of financial failures. He had to sell the pristine luxury sedans and forfeit his prized exclusive membership at the Pine Valley Country Club. The bank seized the sprawling suburban estate to satisfy his outstanding corporate debts. Every single dollar from the crowdfunding campaign was returned to the generous donors of the mountain community. The stolen union hazard pay was restored to my medical escrow account with added interest. Sydney faced her own harsh reality. The State Department of Revenue dissolved Summit Elite Survival Preparedness, seizing the remaining cheap tactical inventory. Stripped of her stolen funding and her artificial internet followers, she was forced to seek actual employment for the first time in her life. The former golden child, who once spent her afternoons curating an aesthetic lifestyle on luxury lodge balconies, is now folding synthetic fabrics at a retail outlet mall near the interstate. She earns a minimum wage and takes public transportation to her shifts. The financial ruin was profound, but the criminal justice system demanded a physical penalty. The district judge overseeing the plea agreement recognized the unique cultural violation of their crimes. They had exploited the sacred trust of the Wilderness Response Brotherhood to fund a vanity project. Therefore, the judge mandated 500 hours of supervised community service for both Richard and Patricia. However, this was not the type of community service my mother was accustomed to. She could not fulfill her hours by organizing charity galas or serving on prestigious museum boards. The court assigned them to the Colorado State Parks Department Manual Labor Division. Their designated tasks involved deep, backcountry trail maintenance. 3 days a week, the former country club elites are required to wear bright orange reflective vests over cheap generic work clothes. They haul heavy bags of refuse down steep, rocky inclines. They shovel thick gravel to repair washed-out hiking paths damaged by the spring thaw. Their primary duty involves scrubbing the public compost latrines located at the high-altitude base camps. The people who once despised my calloused hands and my dirt-stained uniform are now forced to scrub human waste from the very mountains I dedicated my life to protecting. They perform this grueling physical labor under the strict supervision of local park rangers who possess zero tolerance for arrogance or complaints. It is a flawless, undeniable delivery of poetic justice. While my parents descended into their newly mandated reality, I focused entirely on my physical reconstruction. The road to recovery was paved with intense, agonizing effort. I spent countless hours in specialized physical therapy clinics, funded securely by my independent union benefits. I performed repetitive strength exercises, pushing my shattered femur to rebuild its density and structural integrity. The titanium rods fused perfectly with the bone grafts. The deep tissue damage caused by the frostbite healed, leaving faint, pale scars across my knuckles. I did not receive a single phone call or text message from my family during this arduous 6-month period. Their silence was a profound blessing. I was no longer expending vital emotional energy attempting to earn the approval of people who viewed me as a disposable asset. Every ounce of my stamina was directed toward a single goal. I wanted to return to the jagged peaks. 6 months after the charity gala, I sat in a sterile examination room at the orthopedic clinic. My lead surgeon reviewed my final imaging scans. He smiled and reached for his specialized medical tools. The heavy titanium brace that had encased my right leg for half a year was unbuckled and removed. The physical weight lifted from my body, but the psychological liberation was infinitely more significant. I stood up and placed my bare foot flat against the linoleum floor. I took a step without the aid of aluminum crutches. The joint held firm. The bone was solid. I was whole again. I walked out of the clinic breathing the crisp, unfiltered air of a late spring morning. I hailed a ride to the central dispatch headquarters of my Wilderness Response Unit. The gravel parking lot at the dispatch center was filled with the familiar sights and sounds of my chosen community. My customized response truck was parked in its designated spot. Evelyn had successfully nullified the forged promissory note, clearing the caveat from the title. The predatory lenders released the lien after realizing the underlying documentation constituted a federal forgery. The heavy-duty winch and the reinforced chassis gleamed under the bright morning sun. Commander Vaughn stood near the open garage bay, organizing coils of professional climbing rope. Sarah, the junior paramedic, was checking the inventory of a trauma kit. They looked up as I walked across the lot. I moved with a slight, deliberate limp, but I was walking under my own power. There was no grand theatrical celebration. There were no fake speeches or hollow toasts. Vaughn simply nodded his head, acknowledging my return, with quiet, profound respect. Sarah handed me a heavy canvas pack filled with emergency supplies. We had a scheduled training deployment on the Western Ridge. I accepted the pack, feeling the familiar, comforting weight settle against my shoulders. We loaded the equipment into the response vehicle. The engine roared to life, vibrating with raw mechanical power. I sat in the driver's seat, wrapping my scarred hands around the steering wheel. Just before I shifted the transmission into gear, my personal mobile phone chimed in the center console. I glanced at the glowing screen. It was an incoming text message from an unsaved number, but I instantly recognized the cadence of the writing. It was Patricia. She complained about the agonizing back pain caused by shoveling gravel on the public trails. She detailed the humiliation of taking the public bus to the state park office. The message ended with a desperate plea for a small financial loan to cover her mounting legal fees. She claimed we were still family, deep down. I read the pathetic words glowing on the glass screen. A year ago, a message like that would have triggered a deep internal conflict. I would have agonized over my duty as a daughter, balancing my self-respect against a manufactured sense of obligation. Now, I felt nothing. The emotional tether had been severed permanently. I did not reply to the message. I did not offer a polite refusal or a vengeful insult. I simply deleted the text and blocked the contact number from my device. I slipped the phone back into my tactical pocket. I looked out through the windshield at the towering, majestic peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The sky was a brilliant, unblemished blue. I engaged the transmission and steered the heavy truck up the steep, winding road. I left the wreckage of their superficial lives far behind me, driving upward toward the clean, cold air, alongside the only family I would ever need. There is a specific, suffocating kind of silence that descends just before a mountain gives way. It is a heavy, uncompromising quiet that strips away all pretense, leaving only the raw, terrifying truth of nature. Yet when I reflect on the harrowing journey of Matilda Hayes, a young woman who dragged her shattered body from the icy grip of a Rocky Mountain avalanche, only to be buried alive by the deceit of her own parents, I am struck by a much darker realization. The steepest, most lethal cliffs we will ever face are rarely made of granite and frost. They are constructed in our own living rooms. Matilda's narrative is not merely a satisfying tale of corporate fraud dismantled by a brilliant tactical mind. At its absolute core, it is a devastating autopsy of the American family. The chilling contrast between the selfless, gritty heroism of the Wilderness Response Brotherhood and the manicured, predatory entitlement of the country club elite is not merely a dramatic backdrop. It is a profound cultural indictment. It forces us to peer past the velvet ropes of our own lives and examine the foundational bedrock of parenting, family responsibility, and what it truly means to guide a child through a society dangerously obsessed with superficial prestige. In modern American culture, we are aggressively sold a highly specific, glossy image of the traditional family. It is a portrait painted with leased luxury sedans, manicured suburban lawns, and carefully curated holiday cards that hide the quiet desperation buzzing behind closed doors. We are conditioned to measure successful parenting by the external markers of achievement, the exclusivity of the zip code, the prestigious university decals on the rear windshield, and a flawless, heavily filtered social media presence. But Matilda's ordeal tears down this fragile facade, revealing the toxic rot that festers when parents treat their children not as autonomous human souls requiring emotional cultivation, but as divergent assets in a social portfolio. In their relentless pursuit of the American dream, her parents confused wealth with worth. They believed that providing the aesthetic illusion of success absolved them of the heavy, unglamorous daily labor of emotional intimacy. They did not look at their daughters and see children to be nurtured. They saw a golden mascot to be elevated and a disposable workhorse to be exploited. Their failure was not merely financial. It was a catastrophic collapse of basic emotional awareness and familial duty. When a family operates as a prestige-obsessed corporation rather than a secure sanctuary, the children are inevitably forced to become either manipulative shareholders or exploited laborers. There is no middle ground. To raise a child within a traditional family structure requires a terrifying, unflinching level of honesty. It demands the willingness to look in the mirror and ensure your own ego is not eclipsing your offspring's development. Fairness in parenting does not mean buying identical gifts or dividing a financial estate equally. It means distributing emotional safety with an even, unwavering hand. When parents play favorites, elevating one child into a gilded cage of unearned praise while pushing the other into the freezing dark to prove their worth, they are not raising a family. They are breeding a lifelong war. This psychological warfare leaves invisible, jagged scars that no orthopedic surgeon can pin back together. Children possess an acute inherent radar for injustice. They know exactly when the emotional ledger is unbalanced. Matilda spent her entire life scaling literal mountains, enduring frostbite and shattered bones, silently hoping her immense physical sacrifices might finally tip the scales of her parents' affection. She learned the agonizing, liberating lesson that you can never earn the love of people who view your suffering solely as an inconvenience, or worse, a monetization opportunity. By rewarding the sisters' superficiality and actively punishing Matilda's rugged authenticity, the parents did not just steal money. They actively sabotaged their children's moral development. Long-term guidance for children should equip them to navigate an unpredictable world with resilience, empathy, and a strong internal moral compass. It requires parents to act as steady, unwavering anchors in a chaotic sea. But what happens when the anchor is the very thing dragging the child underwater? The deepest tragedy of this dynamic was the complete and utter absence of emotional awareness. The parents were so blinded by the glittering lights of luxury resorts and the suffocating, relentless pressure of elite social survival that they lost their fundamental humanity. True long-term guidance requires a parent to step back and allow a child to develop their own authentic identity, even if that identity starkly contradicts the family's curated aesthetic. Matilda's parents viewed her blue-collar, life-saving profession not as a virtue to be celebrated, but as a public relations problem to be managed. When they could not manage it, they simply stole it, repackaging her blood and sweat into a clean, marketable commodity for the golden child. They forged signatures, stole medical funds, and defrauded charitable communities without a single tremor of conscience. They believed their biological title granted them unquestionable jurisdiction over Matilda's life. They forgot the most crucial rule of human connection. Respect is an inheritance you must continually earn through daily action, not a tax you can violently collect by right of birth. Without honesty and fairness as the unshakable pillars of parenting, the entire familial structure eventually collapses under the weight of its own deceit. We must confront these uncomfortable realities if we ever hope to break the cycle of generational trauma. We must elevate the stories of those who refuse to remain silent victims in the shadows of their own homes, people who use their intelligence and grit to reclaim their stolen lives. If you have ever felt like the invisible pillar holding up a family that only knows how to take, if you have ever had to build your own table because the one you were born at had no chair for you, you are not alone. Join our community of survivors, strategists, and truth-tellers. Subscribe and follow Cherry Vengeance Stories to hear more narratives of quiet resilience, tactical brilliance, and the profound, beautiful liberation of walking away. Share your own experiences in the comments below, because every time one of us speaks the truth, another heavy rusted chain is permanently broken. We are building a new kind of family here, one rooted in fairness, unflinching honesty, and mutual respect. Ultimately, we are conditioned by centuries of cultural dogma to believe that blood is thicker than water. We are commanded by society to forgive, to honor our mother and father unconditionally, and to preserve the traditional family unit at all costs, even if the cost is our own sanity, financial security, and survival. We are taught that to walk away from our creators is the ultimate moral failing. But I submit to you a radically different philosophy, one born from the freezing peaks and the shattered illusions of those who have survived the unspeakable. Blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. It is the introduction to a story, not the binding contract of a lifetime. The conventional wisdom dictates that family is permanent, that we owe an unpayable eternal debt to the people who gave us life. But life is not a loan, and parenthood is not a transaction. The most enduring, authentic families are rarely the ones we are born into by genetic lottery. They are the ones we bleed for. They are the ones we freeze on the side of a mountain with the ones who pull us out of the wreckage, without ever asking for a receipt or a public relations photo. Perhaps the most profound act of parenting is not holding on, but recognizing when your own toxicity means you have forfeited the right to stay. And perhaps the ultimate, most beautiful triumph for a child is not fixing a broken home, but having the cold, magnificent courage to strike the match, burn the poisonous structure to the ground, and walk away by the light of the fire. As you look at the faces across your own dinner table tonight, observing the quiet conversations and the shifting glances over the porcelain plates, ask yourself a terrifying question. Are you tied together by genuine, unwavering love, or are you simply sitting in the same room, silently waiting to see who will audit the ledger first?